Okay, here I am. This is here now of the 2nd of May. Vive 1er Mai. Long live the 1st of May. And it is certainly being respected and a day of action around the world for workers everywhere. You know, the people who actually make everything work. Okay. Now, today, I have some explanations to make, and Steve Struggle's not available to speak with us today because of some medical setback, and he's recovering. I am not in the best of shape myself, actually, on a new medication for high blood pressure. And we continue nonetheless, even though I am now 78 years old or 78 years young or whatever, like. So, first of all, I have to clarify a fundamental definition of what it is to be Jewish. Because the left, the populist left, the reactionary populist left, uses an argument that is supposedly anti-Zionist, but it's not. It's just anti-Ashkenazi, anti-Jewish. One could argue that it's not necessarily Judeophobic or anti-Semitic, but the arguments used by the reactionary populist left in the West is nonetheless reactionary. It's anti-Jewish. The reason why is because the argument is being made, that the Jewish Zionists in Palestine are a colonial settler movement of people who claim to be Jewish but are not. And they claim to be Jewish for the purpose of colonizing the land and claiming to be indigenous to that land. But the reactionaries will try to counter that argument by claiming that the Ashkenazim are not Jewish in the first place. And so this is supposed to be an anti-Zionist argument. However, it's false. So using a false argument against Zionism is bolstering Zionism, because the Zionists know that you're using a false argument, and therefore you are reinforcing their Zionist convictions, and at the same time confusing the entire left and bringing them to use an argument that will fail. And they are in a dead end, and they don't even know it. Okay, the problem is this. The Jewish people are mainly divided into two categories, depending upon their origins. First of all, the Jewish people in the Orient are Semites and come from the same biological background as do the Palestinians, who are also Semites, children of Sem, one of the sons of Noah. Okay. And they both speak or use the Semitic language of Hebrew, even though in the ancient Israelite times, Hebrew was not the language of discourse. It was the language of Judaism, liturgical language, much like Latin is the language of the Catholic Church and of the Roman Empire Christianity. And Latin was the language of the Roman Empire and became the language of the church as well, because it was a state religion, drafted and rewritten to be a bolster to the Roman Empire, which was then transferred over to the various other empires which succeeded the Roman Empire, like the British Empire and now the US Empire. Now, Jewish people went to live throughout the Orient, especially in North Africa. And there is also a number of the indigenous nationalities or tribes in the Maghreb of Northern Africa who converted to being Jewish. But there were also Jewish people who just, moved all over the place, as other nationalities tend to do as well. So there was a large Jewish population in the Maghreb of Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and even Egypt and Libya as well. The other segment of the Jewish people were transferred to Europe by the Roman Empire, either as slaves or as traders, and went to live in Rome until they found a freer way of living in the German Ruhr River area around the city of Worm. And that's where the Ashkenazim lived for many hundreds of years and acquired ancient German mixed with Hebrew as a dialect called Yiddish. Yiddish, which is my language. Actually, my first language is Yiddish because when my parents came as refugees from the Holocaust to Canada by way of the sponsorship of my father's sister, who had been a citizen of Canada previously, we were allowed into Canada. But my parents didn't speak English. We lived in Toronto, in the Bathurst Bloor area of Toronto. And the first 5 years, I only spoke with my parents in Yiddish. Actually, I always spoke with my parents in Yiddish. I refused to use English to speak with my parents because I wanted to maintain my Yiddish language. And Yiddish is a Germanic language. And I can actually converse, with modern day Germans without too much difficulty in rudimentary German with my Yiddish dialect, which became more of a language, when the Jewish people moved to Poland. Why did they move to Poland? One, the King of Poland offered them work, which they were discriminated against, in Germany. And so they went to Poland, to get work and a greater degree of freedom, to be able to work in the first place. And also because they were chased into Poland by the First Crusades, which came to attack the Jewish people in Europe because they were Orientals and they were rejected as being residents of Europe because they weren't Christian. Same thing happened in Spain, of course, in 1492, whereas previously Jewish people were tolerated and only allowed to function in society if they converted to Christianity, which many did. But even though they had converted to Christianity, these conversos were later subjected to both discrimination, oppression, expulsion, and execution by the Ferdinand Isabella regime of the Catholic Church. And it is notable that the so-called progressive Pope of today hasn't even sought to apologize for the Inquisition in Spain, for the Crusades thereafter, which came to attack the Jewish people, and moved into the Middle East where they attacked the Muslims as well. I'm talking about genocide here. They weren't attacking, any army. They were attacking the people and killing off as many of the Orientals as they could in order to implant their own settler colonial enterprise, which worked to a certain extent in Lebanon, where the Christian Maronites have a determining power in the government apparatus there, even though they compromise and divide up the various senior political positions between the Muslims and the Maronites. So the Ashkenazim, of which I am one, from Poland, specifically from the Warsaw Ghetto, from which my mother escaped, and from the Lublin Ghetto, the city of Lublin in the south of Poland, from which my father escaped, both of my parents escaping into the Soviet Union, which offered refuge to the Jewish people, while every other country in the West refused sanctuary for the Jewish refugees, in particular the SS Saint Louis, which came with hundreds of Jewish refugees from Germany and were turned back by Cuba, United States, and Canada. And they went back, landed in France, which was later occupied by the Nazis, and half to three-quarters of those Jewish refugees on the boat SS Saint Louis later died in death camps of the Nazis. The scale of the Nazi Holocaust should be understood as well, which it is not. The left doesn't even, mention the Holocaust anymore. The left doesn't talk about the Jewish insurgency against the Nazi occupation in the Warsaw Ghetto of 1943. That's not mentioned either, even though it was a rebellion against Nazi occupation. And supposedly, the left and the Soviet Union were against the Nazi occupation, but it's not mentioned by either party. And furthermore, the Soviet Union made a deal with the Nazis to divide up Poland between the two of them. And the Soviet Union at that point couldn't care less, that a large number of the Jewish people in Poland would be under Nazi occupation. And they did not make any provision in the agreement with the Nazis for the protection and security of the Jewish people in Poland whatsoever. And the Soviet Union under Stalin got two territorial concessions by the Nazis, who agreed to a division of Romania, in which a section of Romania was handed over to Russia as part of that agreement. And there's also another territory which was ceded to the Soviet Union of the time as part of the Soviet Union's agreement to the Nazi occupation of the Eastern European territories, Czechoslovakia, Poland, whatever. And Russia, was going to tolerate all that because Russia was no longer seeking international socialist revolution against fascism. It was collaborating with fascism. The other collaborators, with the Nazis were the Zionists, both right-wing and left-wing, whose worldview was that fascism was winning the World War and that they would win the war, and therefore they were obliged to negotiate with the Nazis for the sake of their own party members, which they did, and they secured the release of 60,000 Zionists in Germany, and in Hungary, 1,984, I believe, were released, whereas all the rest of the Jewish people were not allowed to leave and were sent to be exterminated in the death camps. The death camps usually had 3 trainloads of Jewish people brought in and sent to be gassed and cremated immediately, except for the strongest, who were kept as slaves. And they had about 1,000 Jewish people on each train, and there were 3 trainloads of people that were brought into each of the death camps per day. So that was 3,000 killed per day in each death camp. And the death camps were numerous, much more numerous than is conceded or known about in the West. In fact, there was 14 death camps, including the first one, Dachau, inside Germany. But the other death camps were placed outside of Germany, where they couldn't disturb the Christian sensibilities of the German population. Okay, so, if I speak Yiddish, and ich kann reden Yiddish, ich kann sich reden Yiddish so geht, wie die Deutsche können reden Deutsch. So I'm saying, that I'm speaking Yiddish, as well as anybody else, speaks their own language, including, how well the Germans speak German, like I'm speaking Yiddish. Yiddish is my language. So, like if I'm speaking Yiddish, like I must have had, a connection to Germany in a valley, like at some point of origin. I'm not speaking Kazakhstan, like I'm speaking Yiddish. Get it? Like Jewish people do not come from Kazakhstan. The Ashkenazim did not come from Kazakhstan. There was no sort of immigration of Jewish people from Kazakhstan who came into Poland either, to form the Ashkenazim, which is a nuance made of that argument, because the argument itself is so ludicrous. So, um, next, another argument used by the so-called progressives in solidarity with the Palestinians, another argument that they use and try to combat Zionism, a false argument. And they couldn't care less, it seems, if it's false, because it's an argument and they don't know how else, to combat Zionism, to argue against Zionism. And they don't take the arguments of Zionism on a first basis. They don't deal with the arguments that the Zionists present. They only deal with arguments that are false in order to counter the Zionists, because they don't know how to counter the Zionists. Okay. So they make up stuff. So they're saying, that Jewish people are not a people and do not have a right to self-determination, which is the claim of the Zionists. And so the only thing that they know how to do, to counter Zionism is to say the opposite of what the Zionists are saying, even if it's not true. Okay. And the Zionist use of those arguments are fallacious to begin with, but the progressives don't know how to sort of criticize the arguments used by the Zionists. For instance, the so-called progressive reactionaries of the left, they make the argument that the Ashkenazim of Europe, the Jewish people of Europe, do not have a biological connection to the Semitic populations of the Western Orient and Palestine in particular. Well, is that true or not true? Because that's, like a piece of evidence. If there was no genetic connection of the Ashkenazim with the Orient, then they couldn't claim, to be part of the original Israelites. You cannot claim any historical connection to the land. You cannot claim to be indigenous in any way whatsoever. Okay, so let's look at the DNA evidence. There is evidence presented saying that there is no Semitic connection of the Ashkenazim with Semitic populations of the Western Orient because they've taken some DNA samples, which are the maternal DNA samples of the mitochondria, which is true. The Jewish maternal DNA comes from Europe. Why? Because the Jewish men, the Jewish Semitic men of Palestine were brought into Europe by the Roman Empire, as mentioned, and their DNA remained Semitic. Now, if you do a test of paternal DNA of the Ashkenazim, you will find out that it is indeed Semitic. So the Jewish Ashkenazim are half European and half Semitic, maternal and paternal DNA, and influences as well. So in Jewish religious criterion of Judaism, the women who created families with the Jewish Semitic men in the Roman Empire had converted to being Jewish, according to Orthodox Jewish law, which is permitted. And so they became Jewish. So in terms of cultural affinity, the Jewish children of those families were brought up as being Jewish and remained Jewish. And the discrimination against the Jewish people was such that these families remained Jewish and did not intermarry with the German Christian population because the German Christian population rejected the Jewish Semitic population because they were Orientals. And the European prejudice of the Christians was against any Orientals who were considered to be inferior in one way or another. And so they were rejected. and also Christianity uh, imposed a homogeneity on the society in which they established a nation state that was Christian, according to um, the ambitions of the original nation state proposition by Hegel in Germany in 1648, in which um, uh, the Christian population was considered to be German, whereas the Semitic population of Germany was not considered to be German, even though they were German residents and all of that. This is reflected even today in Poland, where Poland does not recognize the Jewish people as being citizens of Poland, as being Polish, even though my parents spoke Polish to each other. And every day, the last thing my mother said to me was "Budź spać," which is Polish. That means "go to sleep, kid," basically. So um, nowadays, even though I have proof of the birth of my father in Poland from the local registry, and my mother's proof of Polish origin in terms of the documents provided by the refugee board in Wetzlar refugee camp in Western Germany after the war, when she left the Soviet Union. All the proof there is that my parents were Polish, but I'm presenting this documentation to the Polish consulate here and to the governor of the Warsaw region of Poland, and even to the president of Poland, to which I appealed. The citizenship of my parents was rejected, even though they had been born there. Why? Because they weren't baptized. They weren't Christians. And because they didn't have a passport. And if they didn't have a passport, that was considered to be proof that they weren't Polish, even though the proof of their birth in Poland was confirmed. Why? Because they weren't Christian. Christians wouldn't be subjected to the same treatment. And the reason why they didn't have a passport in the first place was because they were escaping from Poland on foot across the border, walking into the Soviet Union in order to escape from the Nazi occupation in Poland. But no, that's not important, for the Polish government at this time. And they used the Nuremberg criterion for who is a citizen and who is not a citizen. My parents are not considered to be citizens of Poland, even though they were Polish, and therefore I am not considered to be a citizen of Poland, and Polish citizenship was denied to me as a result. So, like this is tied up, with the argument made by many so-called reactionary anti-Zionists, so-called anti-Zionists, who argue, that the Israeli Jewish population should just go back to where they came from. And this is a big argument, and is oftentimes, listed as all the prime ministers of the Zionist state of Israel who came from other countries in Europe, primarily. And so the argument is made that they are not, from Palestine, therefore they should just go back to the countries from which they came from. Well, like how are they supposed to get back to Poland if Poland doesn't recognize them as citizens? They wouldn't be allowed back into Poland. Like I am not allowed to be a Polish citizen. So that argument fails, but they still use that argument. So, the idea of such an argument, that's used by supposed anti-Zionists is that Jewish people are not a people that have a right to self-determination and therefore do not have a right to set up a state in Palestine in exclusion of the Palestinians. The argument to be used there, the problem with the Jewish right to self-determination being implemented in that way is that such a right cannot be implemented by denying the very same right on the part of the Palestinians. It's a contradiction in and of itself. It violates what I call the principle of reciprocity, which I explained and defined, even in the theorem, in my doctoral thesis in the chapter on that question. So the Zionists claim, to be exercising Jewish self-determination, while it sounds good, to Jewish people and to those people, sympathetic, to the plight of Jewish refugees, etc., it doesn't work, in the context of Palestine because there's another people there as well who are seeking their self-determination against the British occupation. And even though the Zionists were against the British occupation, fought against the British occupation with violence and terrorism, nonetheless, they couldn't conceive of forming a united front together with the Palestinians to fight against the British occupation and set up a national country. No. And when this was realized at a rather late date, the cultural Zionists who were advocating for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but not a Jewish exclusive state, they quit, like Einstein. He quit the Zionist movement at that point when he realized that the state project was in violation of elementary principles of human uh, reconciliation and principles of all of humanity. Because any given right or principle has to apply all of humanity. Otherwise, it is not what it claims to be. It is not a right. So the reason why all of this is very crucial is because this occupation of Palestine is not a simple colonial settler enterprise. If one compares this conundrum with, let's say, Algeria, in which Algeria was occupied by the French military, and then France, the state of France, the Christian state of France, sent colonialists to settle in and exploit, the country, using the local population as a slave caste, basically dividing up the society into caste order. And in order to function effectively, they granted citizenship to the local Algerian Jewish population in order to use them as administrators in their colonial enterprise. And therefore, the alienation between the Jewish Algerians and the Algerian Muslims and the Algerian indigenous nationalities there became a much a greater problem than it would otherwise have been. Nonetheless, the Jewish population of the Maghreb were not treated in the same way as they were in Europe. Whereas in European countries, when the various countries were occupied by the Nazi expansionism, they collaborated with the Nazis in getting rid of the Jewish people in their own countries. This did not happen in the Muslim Arab countries of North Africa. It did not happen in any of the Arab countries, nor did it happen in the Persian country of Iran either. So this is something that is not taken into consideration at all by the so-called left, which doesn't consider the status of the Jewish people and seem to follow on still the original sort of Marxian proposition of 1847 in the book The Jewish Question pamphlet, which called upon the Jewish people to give up being Jewish, because to be Jewish is defined in an economic definition by Marx as being those people who are engaged in capitalist enterprise. Capitalist enterprise like tailor shop or blacksmithing, or, these small shops, like workshops that Jewish people, invented and worked on, was considered to be the source of capitalism. Where the Jewish, bourgeoisie, grew in a more serious way in terms of finance was in a domain, which the Christian nation state could not control because money was money and it didn't have any sort of national definition. So money could be used, by the Jewish bourgeoisie to form a bank. And these banks were denounced and sort of categorized as being sort of an evil phenomena because they charged interest. Now, what about the Christian banks? What about the Christian banks in the Roman Empire? What about the Christian bank in the Roman Empire in Rome that was called the Medici? They are sort of considered to be these cultural icons that sponsored, cultural development and were a progressive force and everything, even though they were a bank. What's the difference between the two? None. I mean, each bank, the Rothschild Bank or the Medici Bank, charged interest. So it is a lie to say that the Christian banks did not charge interest, because they did, just as much as the Jewish banks did. So why is a Jewish bank evil and a Christian bank not evil? Is because the Christian banks did not charge interest for the church when the church borrowed money for its various projects. But the Jewish banks, did charge interest. So the Catholic Church, went to the Christian banks, of course. But the kings, they did go, to the Jewish banks, to get as much capital as they could, to wage their wars, in which they thought, each would, like invest in waging war. And then they expected, like short-term pain for long-term gain. That's the imperialist slogan. And they figured that they were going to be able to take over some other country and loot it for its wealth and pay off their bank loan. But if they lost the war, they weren't able to pay back the loan, from the Jewish banks. So what did they do? They expelled them. They just, expelled the Jewish banks and didn't pay back, the loan that they had taken, from them. Simple. Okay. So the Jewish bourgeoisie, eventually figured out, that they needed a state of their own to protect their wealth. And that's what the Zionist state of Israel is. It's a bourgeois nationalist project. It formed a popular front to gain the support of the Jewish people as a whole, and establishing a state which they claimed, would offer security for the Jewish people. But evidently, the only security that it offers is to the Jewish bourgeoisie, so that they cannot be looted again and expropriated, by some king somewhere. Okay. So and also, the security offered by a Zionist, state there would mean that the Jewish people can be expelled from from that country because they would have the power to resist. However, in terms of security for the general population, there is none, because they are engaged in a permanent war against the local population, and therefore there are retaliatory military defense measures taken by the local population and the surrounding countries that refuse the military domination exercised by the Greater Israel Project. So there is no security in that state for the Jewish people, and yet they claim that is the purpose of that state, when in fact it is merely a state which secures the interests of the Jewish bourgeoisie. Now, what provides security for that Zionist state? It's because the Zionist strategy has always been to form an alliance with one imperial power or another. They went to all of them, even though all of them were anti-Semitic. They couldn't care less, like they just accepted that they were anti-Semitic and that they would want to get rid of their own indigenous, Jewish population, and so would support a Zionist project to transfer the Jewish population of Europe into a settler colonial enterprise backed by Western imperialism that would put down the local population, prevent the national liberation movements of the various Arab peoples and Oriental peoples, and form a bulwark um, that would be conducive to the entry of the Crusader forces back into the Orient. So Israel forms an alliance with the Maronites Christian population of Lebanon, and they seek to overthrow any government, of the surrounding countries that would be antagonistic, to the imperial project. So Israel, as we have seen, works together with the United States of America to attack Iran, because Iran is an independent country that is calling for revolutionary overthrow of the imperial project in the Orient. Iran is a revolutionary country. The criticism and justification for the war on Iran is that it is a reactionary theocratic state that is oppressing its own people. However, its own people have come to defend that state, whether or not they are religious or not. So that's the first observation to be made. Second observation to be made there in that context is that while the United States claims that it is fighting Iran on behalf of democracy and seeking to liberate the Iranian people from a dictatorship, they ignore the fact that Iran has elections. The government of Iran was elected by its own people. Likewise, in Iraq, the government is elected, and it is not a pro-US imperial government either. Now, the allies of the United States, on the other hand, are all aristocratic dictatorships of the Sunni variety, which do not have elections. And yet they are claiming that they're waging war on Iran on behalf of democracy and freedom, even though they are bolstering the dictatorships of the area. So this is not mentioned at all. Even, Iranian dissident, Lego videos that are made. And I made one in particular, which made an appeal to the Americans on the basis of respect for the democracy that they have nurtured to some extent. And, even though they express their admiration for New York City culture and all that, nonetheless, they don't mention that the United States is supporting dictatorships and, fighting against a country that is a democracy, which is Iran. They missed that point because they assume, that the Americans know that Iran is a democracy and holds elections. But the Americans don't know that. They haven't been told that, and they will not be told that unless the dissidents bring that up and make it a point. But they don't. Another loss, there. So now, if a critique of Iran as a theocratic state is to be considered to have any validity whatsoever, then the same critique must be made of any other theocratic state. What other theocratic state do we have on hand? Well, it's the United States of America. And the progressive left, they don't mention that at all, because they don't want to antagonize any Christians. And they think that, Christianity is something that they can use as a progressive force, because Christianity stands for peace and love. Excuse me, Christianity does not stand for peace and love for everyone. It only, proposes peace and love for Christians. And then everybody else, can drop dead, basically. So United States of America is a theocratic state as well. And yet the progressive reactionary left doesn't mention that. So how can they oppose, Iran on the basis that it's a theocratic state and oppressing its people and limiting their choice of lifestyle, when in fact they're doing the same? And in the video that I will show later on, that is an excellent interview with two ex-Christian evangelical people who expose, what that story is all about. I will show it to you. But the Christian evangelicals, especially in the South, are a continuation of the Confederate slave state that was established at that time, called the United States of America. And that Southern, white Christian supremacist mentality represents about 30% of the US population. So this 30% is the support base of the Trump administration and is reflected in the Secretary of War, Hegseth, who is himself a Christian evangelical, with a huge tattoo on his chest, with the cross that the Crusaders used. But it was modified by the Luftwaffe to be a shorter cross that he has tattooed on him that resembles the cross used by the Christian Nazis, because the Nazis were Christian. You know, to say that the Nazis, were atheists or they were founding their own religion is false. Basically they were using Christianity as a rationale for their reactionary regime. And this is the same regime that Hegseth is seeking to implement in the United States of America. Hegseth is it coincides, with the with the Trump administration's concept of a Christian nation state as well. And in fact, Trump himself has mentioned that he's proud of his German blood and soil there again, which is the Nazi slogan. So Trump and Hegseth come from the same milieu and support the same purpose of establishing a worldwide United States domination of the economic and cultural life of the world on the basis of their Christian domination. And this is what's called Christendom, in which there's a worldwide Christian empire. This was begun by the Roman Empire, transferred to the British Empire, and is now in the hands of the American Empire. And yet, the progressive reactionary left of the West say that the cause of the problem is Jewish supremacy, not Christian supremacy. No, it's Jewish supremacy that's the problem. And they refuse to criticize Christianity because they figured that they would have more support amongst the Christian population if they attack Jewish people and Jewishness as opposed to Christianity. And so they are opportunistic and seek to form a reactionary alliance with sympathetic Christian people who do not go along with, what the Zionists are doing on the basis that they are Christian and not Jewish. And they blame Judaism, for this genocidal war on Gaza. Really, they don't even notice, that Christian evangelical Zionism formed the origins of Zionism, got the support of a certain percentage of the Jewish people, especially in Europe, amongst the Ashkenazim, who are seeking a way out of the discrimination and genocide that they experienced in Europe. So Christian Zionists offer them a solution. The solution is to be expelled from their own countries, refused refugee status in all of the Christian nation states, and sent to populate, on behalf of the Christian domination of the US empire, well, originally a British empire, sent to populate the country of Palestine in much the same way that the Jewish population of Algeria was granted privileges and citizenship of the French Empire in order to function as the agents of that empire in opposition to the local population. So the Jewish population of Palestine are used as imperial agents as well, armed and told to go and occupy as much land as they could, which they are doing now in the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and previously, in Egypt. And with other ambitions which have been announced by the Prime Minister Netanyahu, King Bibi, who talk about a greater Israel that go beyond even those borders into other countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq, up into the Euphrates River. So, to talk about Jewish supremacy is a fundamental error because this Jewish population are being used as agents of Christian supremacy, not Jewish supremacy. Now, amongst the Jewish people, how do they fall for this? How come they're, collaborating, with those powers that were the source of the discrimination and the genocide of the Jewish people in the first place? And how can they adopt, a constitutional model, which is a nation state, on behalf of theocratic rationale? How can they adopt this very model from Europe, which was used to oppress the Jewish people of Europe, and yet they adopt the same practice and use that state, to discriminate and genocide the people amongst whom they wish to live? Well, there are certain rationales in Judaism that are used by the Zionist movement to justify that and claim that they are acting on behalf of God's will. Well, let me get into that. But first, I need a drink. Okay. How do the Zionists get away with that, and convince, a certain proportion of the Jewish people to go along with their imperial project? Well, first of all, they didn't convince very many Jewish people in Europe. They only had a support of about 8% of European Jewish population. They didn't, and they began in Central Europe as a Zionist movement in both Germany and France, but not Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was still very much more Orthodox religious and not Zionist. And they considered themselves to be, citizens of those countries and did not want to leave those countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc. So how did the Zionists, trick the Jewish people into believing that they were being Jewish by supporting Zionism? It's because in the latter version of the Torah, what's called the Old Testament, the Torah plus the Tanakh, which were the writings of the prophets thereafter. But the original Torah, written by Moses, was rewritten by a scribe called Ezra, which contradicted the basic principles of Judaism that were enunciated by Moses in the first place. I mean, the very simple sort of, first principle of the Ten Commandments is, thou shalt not kill. Okay. So this was changed by Ezra by making a reference to the genocide of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were an indigenous Semitic population of the Negev in southern present-day Israel. And in the original version of the Torah, which is used by the Samaritans living on Mount Gerizim and next to Nablus in the West Bank, Palestine, there is no mention of a genocide of the Amalekites as if this was ordered by the deity. And yet, Ezra, introduced this concept that God ordered the genocide of the Amalekites because they had attacked the Jewish nomadic population when they were traveling through Sinai and sought to gain entry to Canaan and were repulsed by the Amalekites, supposedly. And there's some reference, to the Amalekites having decapitated some of these Israelites. Israel being the original name of the Jewish people, but not the name of the land, which was called Canaan. So, and it was claimed, and Ezra wrote in this, story saying that, when the Israelites were fighting against these Amalekites, supposedly coming to genocide all the Israelites, and therefore justified the genocide of the Amalekites as a self-defense measure, claiming that when the Israelites were fighting the Amalekites, uh, Moses was there watching them, and when he raised his hands to God, they were winning the battle. And when his arms got tired, he lowered his arms and they started losing the battle. And so, in order to win the battle and genocide the Amalekites, his assistants, including his brother Aaron, held up his arms up high to the deity, and therefore they were able to win the battle and they exterminated the Amalekites. Now, Ezra wrote in another version of this genocide later on when Saul was the king of Israel, when it was established as a state, in spite of the interdiction to do so by the prophet Samuel, who was against, any kingdom. So the second time the Amalekites are referred to in the passage written into the Torah by Ezra, who was not a prophet, not considered to be a prophet, and was not. He wrote in another description of a genocide against the Amalekites, which was conducted by Saul, the king, who supposedly was ordered by God, according to Ezra, to go and genocide all the Amalekites again. Now, this sort of introduces, a certain quandary, because if the Amalekites were genocided and exterminated in the first place, including all of the civilian population, including all of their animals, etc., then how could they have been there again, to be genocided a second time? So, like something's wrong here, like either they weren't genocided in the first place, or they were genociding somebody else who they just called the Amalekites because genociding the Amalekites in the first place was justified, according to Ezra, by God. And therefore they could do it again, because it was, like a precedent that would justify, a second genocide. Well, this is what's used by the Zionists to convince their military of the IDF, the Imperial Death Force, to go ahead and genocide, the Palestinians of Gaza. Because if the Amalekites, could be genocided, twice, according to Ezra, then, why not a third time? And then, just conveniently refer to the Palestinians of Gaza as Amalekites, even though they weren't, from the Negev, and they were not called Amalekites previously. And they were called the Philistines, who the famous ones, who produced Goliath, who was defeated by David. And of these, of the Palestinians of today in Gaza, a certain percentage are originally of the Philistines, 10 to 15%, which is significant. So they are originally of that region, supplemented by certain migration, from peoples who came from Crete, and other areas, Saudi Arabia, and formed the population of Gaza called Palestinians, after the Roman name for Palestine, and after the original name for Palestine, which was taken from Philistine, which the Romans used to describe the whole area of Canaan, even though the name Philistine only came from Gaza in the first place. Okay, so this area of Philistine was actually the place where David went to find sanctuary after Saul, the king, was hunting him down because Saul wanted to execute David because he was a popular sort of choice, to be king against Saul. Now, Ezra wrote in that Saul went ahead, and committed this genocide of the Amalekites. But because he had taken some of the animals for himself to be used as a loot, looting the property of the Amalekites, of the Philistines, uh, uh, originally. Therefore, this was used as an excuse by Saul to dethrone Saul and force him to resign. And David used this as a justification for hunting down Saul, and eventually courted him, caught him in a cave, and carried out a ritual assassination by tearing his clothing. And therefore, David became king because he had gotten rid of, the previous king under the protection of Samuel the prophet, even though Samuel the prophet didn't support kings in the first place. Now, David and Solomon. Who were they? They're considered to be the prototype of the modern state of Israel. But are they really? Okay. The Zionists claim, that the Jewish people are distinct, separate from the Canaanite population, and had the right, to take over the land and set up a kingdom in their own name, in spite of, the other nationalities, which were numerous, that existed and lived in Canaan at the time. So, what happened? Well, first of all, who were Solomon and David? And do their kingdoms justify the Zionist state of Israel at the present time? The answer is no. Why? Because Solomon and David were the descendants of a mother who was not an Israelite. She was a Moabite, and her name was Ruth. Now, she converted to being Jewish, or Judaic, by adopting, the monotheistic deity proposed by Judaism. And she gave birth to parents who gave birth to Solomon and David. Okay? Now, according to Ezra, in a latter sort of, passage, a Moabite could not become an Israelite until after the 10th generation. Okay. So according to Ezra, Solomon and David were not Israelites because they were only second and third generation after the Moabites. So they were Moabites and Israelites at the same time. But this is not recognized in the Ezra version of the Torah. This is another sort of, like demarcation point that differentiates the original Judaism and the original Torah from the version proposed by Ezra. Now, the Christians come along and pick out the passages that were introduced by Ezra and say, oh, look, here we have, a divine judgment which condones, one, genocide, two, condones a nation state, and three, condones the expansion of the nation state, according to, the will of the deity. So, the Christian evangelical, movement, develops, arising from the various Protestant denominations, who were built upon the basis of nationalism and national identity, and exclusion of the Jewish people in each of their countries. And Christianity extolled itself as being superior to any other religion, and all the religions had to convert to being Christian. Otherwise, they were considered to be infidels, even though they themselves were the infidels, according to Judaism. So you see, it gets, like very involved here, and one has to know where Zionism comes from. So the Zionists adopted the Christian notion of Zionism and used it to justify the establishment of their nation state. and all that goes along with it. And that's the trouble with Zionism. It is based upon a Christian evangelical ideology, which is acknowledged even by Netanyahu, who, when he goes to speak, to a Christian evangelical conference in the United States, concedes that as a Zionist, he is a Judeo-Christian. So Zionism is Judeo-Christianity by admission. Therefore, it couldn't be Jewish supremacy that Zionism represents. It represents Christian theological supremacy. But this is not acknowledged, by the progressive reactionary left in the West because they are Christian. And they will not criticize themselves. They will not criticize the population that they were seeking to gain support from. And they believe that it's much easier to go and garner support amongst the Christians by denouncing Jewish supremacy instead of Christian supremacy and its crusades. But some of the Christian supremacists, like Hegseth, are not shy, and they, extol the right of Christian supremacy to do whatever it wants, and do so in a popular front together with the Zionist supremacists, who, as I mentioned, consider themselves to be Judeo-Christian. So there's, like the problem, that's where the problem of Zionism lies. Not in Judaism, not in the Torah, and not in the Jewish people as a people. The Jewish people are a nation in a people sense, a people nation, with various nations that exist within it. There are the Sephardim, there are the Mizrahim, who are the Oriental Jewish people, or the Spanish Jewish people who used to have their own language of a Jewish variety of Spanish and Hebrew mixed together. And they are a national identity of their own, which is largely mixed, with the Mizrahim Oriental Jewish population now by interbreeding. The other Jewish nation that exists in the Jewish people as a whole are the Ashkenazim, who remained largely separate from the Mizrahim Arab Jewish population. And in fact, this forms an additional layer of apartheid in the Zionist state, in addition to the apartheid imposed upon the Muslim Palestinian population. So there's a double apartheid in Israel. But the second apartheid against the Jewish Mizrahim is not mentioned by the reactionary progressive left of the West because the Mizrahim are pro-Zionist. In fact, they're trying to out-Zionize, the Ashkenazim Zionists in order for their status to be uplifted within that society, and so that they can have a higher position of authority and power because they're acting on behalf of the Zionist state as Zionists. And they take a certain pride in this, and they are more reactionary, even than the Ashkenazim when it comes to Zionism and to war making. So, the critique of the Zionism, by the so-called, progressive Christians of the West do not mention this because they are Jewish pro-Zionists, and therefore their oppression and the apartheid against the Mizrahim by the Ashkenazim is not mentioned because it's not important. This is a complete lack of strategic thinking. Do not understand what a given ideology is, irrespective of what the subjective consciousness of its adherents may be or may not be. And that is ignored. The actual sort of, origins of these ideological apparatus is not analyzed as such. The only sort of analysis made is, subjective analysis in which there's a denigration made of the Jewish people for being pro-Zionist. Even those Jewish people who are non-Zionist and live in the West are still denounced as being Zionists. And this denunciation of the Zionist, pro-Zionist Jewish population goes so far as to denounce these Zionists as being evil. What does evil mean? Evil means that there's should be subject to execution. Anything that's denounced as evil by the Christian mindset, or even the Jewish chauvinist mindset, is that anything that's evil, must be destroyed, and therefore provides a justification for the genocide of those people. So, the difference between denouncing, the crusader mentality of Christian supremacy, as opposed to using an argument, claiming to be opposed to Jewish supremacy. The difference between the two is fundamental, qualitative difference. To use terms such as Jewish supremacy and to denounce Zionism as such is reactionary, anti-Jewish, and can even extend into being Judeophobic and anti-Semitic. And this is supposed to be, okay in the solidarity movement with the Palestinians, even though the Palestinians themselves do not talk in such terms. Palestinians understand and teach in their schools in Palestine that not all Zionists are Jewish, not all Jewish people are Zionists. This is, standard, teaching, point that I hear oftentimes when I'm in Palestine. But here, no, they don't understand that. Doesn't make any sense to them. And they sort of, still harp on the idea of Marx, that Jewish people, must give up being Jewish in order to be kosher, in order to be considered to be progressive. And this is precisely what some people, Jewish people do, especially if they're Israelis and who are disillusioned by Zionism. And so they want to, build their own personal prestige by announcing themselves as being anti-Zionist, and they do so by claiming that they are no longer Jewish, because they're accepting the proposition that of the Zionists that if you are Jewish, you must be a Zionist, and you must become a Zionist. You must be a Zionist in order to protect Jewish people, which is not the case. So, Shlomo Sand, who is considered to be an academic in France, gets away with, like saying he's resigned from the Jewish people. And, everybody claps. Oh, yes, it's wonderful. Like if you can do it, all the other Jewish people can do it, and that's the solution to the problem. No, that's not the solution to the problem. That is the problem, that Jewish people identify with Christianity as an identity, and therefore are in opposition to Jewish identity, actually, when they claim to be Zionists. So you see, it goes, like deeper, like there's layers, upon layers of the problem, with the left critique of Zionism. And even though many people have turned against Zionism, and Israel is now opposed by a majority of the American people, for instance, and even a majority of the younger Jewish Americans. And even though the war in Iran is opposed by 61% of the American population now as well, which is magnificent, but the basis on which they opposed this war in Iran is problematic. And, they have people, like the Marine, who is shouting that he was opposed to the war because he didn't want to fight a war on behalf of Israel. But it's not a war on behalf of Israel. Israel is fighting a war on behalf of the United States. It's the opposite of what is claimed there. And that argument is basically an anti-Jewish argument. It's not an anti-Zionist argument. It's not an anti-imperialist argument. It is a reactionary argument. But it is, like uncriticized and picked up by the progressive reactionary left of the West, and they're not even conscious of what they're doing. It's pathetic. Okay, so those are the points that I have to make, which are still lacking after my critique of the other sort of uh, uh, videos that I have made previously with Steve. And in order to provide you with a proof to this effect, I want to play a video for you that was an interview with two um, people who left the Christian evangelical movement and who are exposing it, for what it really is. And I'd like to play that to you so that you will know how important the Christian evangelical movement is in determining U.S. foreign policy. And I could point out to you that this war against Iran and against Gaza did not take place during the first term of office of the President Trump, or de Trump, actually, which is his real name. This happened with the introduction of the Christian evangelical movement into the support base for Trump, exemplified by the position of the Secretary of War by Hegseth, who is a Christian evangelical, who is the predominant influence upon the Trump administration now. So that with Hegseth in place, we now have the genocide in Gaza, and we have the attack upon Iran as well. The difference between the first Trump administration and this administration is Hegseth. And that's why these wars are taking place, because of the Christian rationale, and which provides the support base for Trump to continue. Now, let me line up the interview with the Christian evangelicals for you. And so I will take a pause here to do so. Okay, I found it. There we go. Okay. Now, the importance of what Christian evangelicalism is proven by this video here and the interviews with these two people here, who will give you firsthand information on what is at the basis of a U.S. foreign policy right now. This is not mentioned, because the media, corporate media, is Christian. And a large part of the left is Christian, because they're inspired by the peace and love, theme of Christianity. And they think, like this is equivalent to socialism. Well, it isn't. And here's the proof.
This is the Left Hook, folks. A very special episode today. I have two guests. For those who watch the Left Hook, they know that I've been trying my best to warn about the dangers and threats of white Christian nationalism. I name it for what it is. I know some people are offended by that. We could talk about why corporate media and institutions don't call it white Christian nationalism. But we have seen slowly but surely how it has now gone mainstream, how its proponents are open. I mean, just like it's like the most helpful Bond villain. They're literally telling you the plot, and they have taken over the Trump administration. In fact, a large reason why we're in this failed, unwinnable war in Iran is because of some of these white Christian nationalists. And some of you know that last Monday, I had the opportunity slash pleasure to take on Pastor Doug Wilson, who is the pastor of Pete Hegseth, pastor, a cosplay crusader who is the Secretary of Defense, one of these white Christian nationalists who wants our soldiers and innocent people die so they can continue LARPing as this warrior for God. There are people who have written about this. I've had them on the show, but very rarely have I actually have I had someone who's actually been part of the movement and has since left. And today, I'm so lucky to be joined by two individuals who are very well known. If you don't follow them on the social medias, what are you doing? The kids love these two. Monty Mater, she's all over the social medias on Instagram, on YouTube, on Blue Sky. She was part and parcel of this movement. She has since left. Tim Whitaker, also a true believer, was part and parcel of this movement, has since left. Tim Whitaker Speaks is on Substack on YouTube. He's also part of the New Evangelicals. And let's start with you, Monty, if you don't mind. No problem. If you can share your superhero origin story, right? So I see you on Instagram, and you were very kind to share that that clip that went viral.
You mean that brilliant takedown?
No, you're very kind.
Anytime you do that, I will share it.
It's very kind. And superficial assumptions. Human beings make assumptions. So I never encountered. I'm like, this lady seems really cool, and she's like, why is this really cool lady sharing my my clip? And all these people like her. And then I clicked on your other videos. I'm like, I would have never thought. I'm amazed by this backstory. Can you share your origin story with us? Because I think it is fascinating.
So yeah, first, thanks for having me. And again, thank you for that amazing takedown in the midst of all my stress and strain. It was just beautiful. I grew up on a cattle ranch in Wyoming, and I grew up in a family that was very, very far right, to the degree that we would stockpile arms against the government. My family was also intrinsically connected with the Republican Party. My dad and my uncle were both state senators, state representatives. My cousin was the Republican county commissioner. Very much grew up in this environment of you can't be a Christian unless you vote Republican. They were never separated. There was never at any point that there was an option for discourse that was different. And my family was extremely, extremely militant, to the degree where we were taught at a very young age the Democrats are going to come hold you at gunpoint. You have to be ready to die for your faith. That was really heightened for teenagers after the Columbine shooting and the She Said Yes book and the Cassie Bernall story coming out. And so I went to all Christian nationalist schools and was privately trained in theology for 10 years, Christian apologetics for 5. I went to and graduated from Liberty University. I took my theology courses with them in Israel, because no matter what your degree is, you're required to take theology courses. For me, I can look back now and I recognize that there were multiple times along the way where I said, this isn't right. This doesn't seem fair. This doesn't seem just. This doesn't seem to be in integrity. But you're also taught in this movement that you're broken and not to trust your mind, questions or sins against God. So you learn to push those down. For me, my pivot, my really hard turning point happened in 2013, where a family member of mine, his half sister, turned up pregnant, and she was 12. And it turned out that she had been assaulted since she was 9. And it immediately turned my very pro-life, no exceptions viewpoint into a real person. And I was forced to face that and educate myself about it for the very first time instead of asking my dad or my pastor. Found out I'd been lied to about everything. And I learned about the history of abortion and the evangelical movement and started deconstructing from there. But when Trump entered the scene was when I finally realized that the movement wasn't the problem, not just isolated beliefs. And as soon as I saw Christians at large fall on their feet in front of Trump, I left the movement entirely and completely abandoned it from that point forward and decided I was going to learn everything I could and fight against it because I had been trained about what they were going to do, which is what they're doing now. And so it became my personal mission to fight against what I had believed in and had been trained to be a part of my whole life.
And this was about 10 years ago, Monty.
Yeah.
It's, folks, before I get to Tim, I just want thank you for sharing with us. I just want people to sit with us for a second. It's very easy for us, for anybody, to look on the outside and say, well, how come you couldn't leave sooner? And, I'm a practicing Muslim. Surprise, spoiler alert, a South Asian American, right? When you grow up in any community, there's community politics. It's so tied to your identity. And human beings have been trained through evolution that if you get exiled, that's tantamount to death. Exile used to mean death. And so to break away from community, to break away from everything you've known, and plus then you put like this celestial stamp of God's disapproval on you, right? It can be a lot. What was the thing, if I may, you said you finally broke, but what, like this, if you can share, because I know it might be tough, that second where you realize I'm making this step publicly and I know there's no coming back, like what was going through your mind?
So I was raised by my dad. He was my only parent my whole life, and he had disowned several of my other siblings already. It was very much a his way or the highway. I grew up in a very strict patriarchal household. If you did not adhere to dad's wishes, you were gone. And I made the decision that I was going to do what's right and I was going to pursue the truth no matter what. But my first thought was this kind of fear and this grief because I knew that I was going to lose my family. I knew I was going to lose my community and my church and the people I went to school with. And what ended up happening with my dad, I had had that feeling building for about a week of just, I have to sit and tell him that I'm not aligning with this anymore. And the day that we had this great conversation on the phone, I was walking back into my job. I was living in New York City at the time. And I said, Dad, I really need to talk to you about something. But when you have a minute, like this weekend, it was a Thursday. When you have a minute this weekend, I want to talk to you about something. And he died 6 hours later. So I never got a chance to sit down and tell him and have that conversation, but it was a different kind of loss. So I did get essentially excommunicated from my family, from my church, from my community. My siblings essentially wouldn't have anything to do with me. But dad's loss was this, I would have lost him either way, but it was a very different kind of grief. So there was a lot of fear moving into that decision over time, especially as Trump's campaign built. But I just got to the point where I said, I can't in good conscience. And one of the things I will give credit to my dad, he taught me always fight for what you believe, even if you're the only one doing it. And for me, it was my new belief. I'm like, I will not put my name behind this man. I will not put my faith behind this man. I will not put what I believe about the ministry of Christ behind this man. Absolutely not. But there was a lot of fear, and it's a loss of identity because your identity, your value, what you believe is going to happen to you in the afterlife is all wrapped up in this performance and in this belief. And when you break away, there's, well, who am I? What I've been in this environment my whole life where people told me what to look like, who I was going to date, how I was going to get married, what my sex life should look like, what my clothes can look like, what my hair color should be, what piercings I can and can't have. And suddenly you're outside of the movement and you have no idea who you are and you're completely by yourself. And it's very, very terrifying. So I had kind of this, not just a crisis of belief, but a crisis of identity, the loss of my dad, and also the loss of, I had been raised in American exceptionalism. And I had this crumbling and this opening of my eyes from my own privilege of, oh, this country is not what I was told it was. And so it was one of the hardest years of my life going from July of 2016 through that next school year.
And it's amazing to see your growth and your success in the past 10 years, but I know it wasn't easy. And I appreciate you sharing that because people they don't see the layers and the stories underneath the Instagram page and the media appearances. And Tim, likewise, people are like, oh, Tim's doing great. New evangelical movement, right? I see him speaking. But there was also the break that you went through. And now you're part and parcel of the movement. You're a man. You're a straight man. You're a straight white man in this movement. Why would you leave such a good gig? Like Monty, I could see, but why, man? That's like voluntarily giving up, your seat at the table.
I mean, the system is made for people who look like me, right? So yeah, for sure. Also a lot of what Monty said is also my story, but it's also a little bit different, which I think it's good that we're both on because Christian nationalism is not monolithic, and the way you kind of get sucked into the movement, it's pretty wide. I was homeschooled for 9 years, went to a small private school, graduated top five out of six. So I was real proud of that growing up. But I was a musician in the church. I worked for an organization called Child Evangelism Fellowship. They're the biggest missions organization preaching the gospel to boys and girls around the world and in public schools in America. So I did that for a lot of years. I did missions trips. And look, I was all in. I mean, I was all in. I believe what I'm being taught about God and the Bible and Christ. I was part of the pro-life movement. There was a small org called Rock for Life, and I would skateboard around town at age 15 with this shirt that said in all caps, abortion is homicide. And on the back, it had 3 statements that said, you will not silence my message, you will not mock my God, you will stop killing my generation. I wore that shirt proudly, thinking I'm on the right side of these issues. So I was an all-in believer, but like Monty said, I think about it like growing up in the basement. You're growing up underground. You just don't know what's above ground. You have all these gatekeepers shaping what you think is above ground. But there are cracks. Over time you start having questions. I mean, some of them are logical, whatever. Hey, if Adam and Eve were the first 2 people ever on the planet, how did that work without it being, unbiblical marriage, right? So things like that. But you also start wondering as you meet new people, wait. My first ever gay coworker, I was shocked that he wasn't what I was taught he was like in church, right? So that body could start changing. But for sure, the moment in 2016 with Trump was such a watershed, the dam broke open movement moment because I was always taught my sexual purity was tied to my belonging and to how much God approved of me. And my partner and I, we were virgins until we got married. Like we did the thing. And imagine my shock watching my Sunday school teachers who taught me that now telling me that if I don't vote for the guy on the cover of Playboy magazine who's bragging about assaulting women, somehow I'm the heretic here. And like Monty said, I was taught to never compromise, and compromise is a four-letter word, even if it costs you everything. So I said, I'm not going to move on this, guys. I refuse to compromise with integrity. In between that and the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID, I call it the unfair of just the social movements. You know, my realizing, dang, I was on the wrong side of a lot of issues, and my tradition was as well. So, as a good Christian, I want us to repent. I want to turn and go the other way, right? So that's what I started doing. I started an Instagram account called the New Evangelicals that blew up, and I handed that over to a different person now. And I make content trying to warn people like Monty does about what is coming because we were trained to be in the Lord's army, as the old Sunday school song goes, and we know what's coming. And I think what's important, and I'll end here, these people are so militant. They are not looking to compromise, they're not looking for democracy. They are looking to take over and never give power back ever. And that's why people like me and Monty and many others can't stop yapping about this because the situation is quite dire.
You know, I appreciate you talking about that Holy Trinity. What I've been saying, what's broken the brains of not just the Epstein class, and this is part and parcel of the Epstein class, but basically of power, was BLM, Black Lives Matter, which is like the lowest bar in hell. That broke their brain. Me Too, because it was a sliver of accountability that challenged the patriarchy and, you know, rape. And that broke the brain. If you read the Epstein files, that truly broke his brain. And then COVID, certain restrictions on your personal freedoms for the greater good. I think those are the three that kind of came together. And you can also sprinkle in, you know, Muslims existing and like gay people like existing, right? Let's sprinkle in that. And that seems to have said, all right, all or nothing, we're playing for all the marbles. And Monty, for people who don't know, what is the end game, right? Because I've studied it, but like, you know, you're there. What's their end game? What do they believe? Like you said, American exceptionalism tied to patriarchy, tied to racism. What is their modus operandi?
So fundamentally, it's about establishing a Christian theocracy. And if you've watched a lot of interviews, especially with far alt-right groups, so Proud Boys, KKK, people like that, they will often compliment the Taliban because of their treatment of women. And if you look at a study of fundamentalist religion across the world, the one thing all fundamentalist religions have in common is the subjugation of women.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the goal is to use God to establish a theocracy that is created in such a way that establishes all benefit part and parcel for white men. White men will be the leaders, they will be the elected officials. And we see this rhetoric online as well that like women will be in the home having as many babies as possible, even if they're teenagers. Because when Roe was overturned, well, actually, even before that, when Alabama first passed its ban, I told people they're coming after Roe.
Yep.
And people thought, no way, there's no way. But when I was growing up, I started school when I was 4, and then I skipped a grade. And so the school did a bunch of IQ testing with me. And up until that point, my dad had said, well, your only purpose in life is to get married and have as many children as possible and submit to your husband. That's all you're good for. He sees these scores of, oh, she's actually really intelligent. New plan, you're still going to do that down the road, but we're going to get you into law school because we need more judges so you can help us overturn Roe. My dad's goal for me was the Supreme Court to do that. And so when I told people that was going to happen, nobody believed me. And once it did happen, I said, they will be coming after contraception, IUDs, IVF. That's never going to happen. You're insane. It's like, no, I grew up in this movement. They told me exactly what they were going to do. And they used God to okay it by saying, well, you know, sex is for procreation, so you shouldn't be doing it unless you want kids anyway. Women are supposed to be subjugated, and they bring in, you know, the doctrine of Eve and original sin. The goal of this ultimately is white supremacy. That's really what it is. That's not what they're going to call it, but it's using the Bible and God as a stamp of approval. The same way that they're using for Iran. They're calling it a just war. They're calling it a holy war. They're using words like Armageddon. It's just an excuse. It's this. If the only thing worse than a tyrant is someone who says that God gave him permission to do it.
Yes,
yeah.
celestial stamp of approval on basically your carnal appetites and desires for power.
Whatever it is that you already want to do, you're going to now say God gave you permission to do it. But ultimately, it's about power and money. and they're just using Christianity because it's a dominant religion. They're using that as their viewpoint. Because, and I say this a lot, that for as much as they speak out against, Islam in general, they actually have a lot of admiration for groups like the Taliban, who are the fundamentalist equivalent. They want to implement the same thing just under a different brand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they refuse. They won't see their own like the nuance in that for themselves about how they're judging an entire religion or demonizing an entire group of people. But they're doing the exact same thing on this side.
About 14 years ago, I was invited to this conference in Ireland where it was the summit against like extremism, violent extremism, put on by Google, which is hilarious, but super duper fancy. And they had all these former extremists on. And if you listen to them, the DNA of most of these extremist groups is very much the same. And you said it, Monty, is so much of it. If you look literally across the board, it's this romanticized vision of a past that never existed.
Never will.
Yeah, never. And the purity of the race or the tribe is infected or threatened by certain groups. Those certain groups are always the outsiders and liberals and gays. And also another really convenient thread among all these groups is women have a role. It has to be subservient to the man, and the woman's greatest job is to birth the prophets of the next age. That's her job, right? And then Tim, so many people who are listening, they always get shocked because what's common to us isn't common to other people. They're like, wait a second, but Jesus, he's like that long-haired socialist hippie guy. How do they, and didn't he like divide like food and give it to like poor people and didn't he like heal the sick without copay? I don't understand. Like I've read I'm not a scholar, but I've read the Bible. How do they justify using Jesus in furtherance of what seems like a very violent white supremacist plot? Tim.
Well, they don't use the Jesus you read about in the four Gospels. They make a white mascot Jesus that thinks you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and that taking care of the sick is socialism, right? So if you actually listen to Christian nationalists, and I mean all across the spectrum, from your Paula Whites to your Doug Wilsons to your Ali Stuckeys to your Matt Walshes, you'll notice they rarely, if ever, quote the actual words of Jesus. Most of them pull from the Hebrew Bible, like, for example, Lance Wallnau, who's the architect of the Seven Mountain Mandate. He says that, Trump is a modern-day Cyrus. So we're not talking about Trump being a Jesus. Trump is a modern-day Cyrus. And here's how Cyrus...
For those who don't know, I've talked about on the left, but can you tell them who Cyrus was and why they like it so much?
Yeah, I mean, well, Monty, why don't you do that? Because you're pretty good at this stuff, probably better than me. But, find knowledge, Cyrus was a non-Jew who essentially brought the Israelites back to the land. And so the analogy is that Trump is not a Christian, but he's being used by God for breaking Christians or making America great again. Is that the general gist?
Yeah, so King Cyrus is their way to kind of sidestep the fact that it's very clear that Trump isn't a Christian, and it's very clear by his behavior. So King Cyrus was a Babylonian king who allowed for the Jews who had been in exile to return to the Holy Land to build the temple. So he was instrumental in that way of kind of returning God's people home. So it's a way for Christian nationalists to still pull from a biblical character who's a pagan, because King Cyrus in this analogy is a pagan, and still say God's tool.
Yeah. I also want to add that there's a great book on this called Ministers of Propaganda by Scott Coley. He coined the term motivated literalism, and he essentially defines it by motivated literalism is when Christian nationalists will use only certain parts of the Bible and take it literally whenever it serves their purpose, right? So, for example, they'll tell you that the earth was created in the literal 6 days, and we'll cite Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, or that there are only two genders, Genesis 1 or Genesis 2. But when Jesus said it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, well, that was a hard issue. That's not really what he meant. And so they employ this tool quite often to always serve themselves. Once you realize that Christian nationalists are always looking for whatever gives them power and control, you will then see the rubric that they use to see the Bible, to interpret the Bible on social issues, on political issues. They will flip-flop, no problem, if it means that their power and their control is heightened in society.
Oh, much like Supreme Court justices and their Plato originalism. I follow up, Tim, real quick, because we've all kind of used this analogy of Jesus being used as a mascot. I think this is important because people don't realize this. The Jesus that they use, or the Jesus that they employ as their mascot. I remember William Boykin. William Boykin was the first one of these Christian nationalists way back in the day, 20 years ago, who during the failed Bush-Iraq war openly was using the same type of language that is now so common about how we're in a religious war. And he got removed, right? So he then gets removed from the army, and then he starts his career in right-wing MAGA and Tea Party, and he openly said, Tim, Jesus will return with an AR-15.
Yes.
How reconcile that? Because again, what's common to you isn't common to everyone else. So like, what?
Let me explain. I'll make this really short and sweet. The Jesus of Revelation is what they're appealing to here. This idea of Jesus coming back as a warrior to slay all of his enemies. His cloak is dipped in the blood of his enemies. This is the Jesus that they envision coming back. Mark Driscoll, a Christian nationalist pastor, has this analogy. Alice Psyche has studied it. So in their mind, the Jesus of the gospel is dead. That if you love in Jesus, no. That's not who's coming back. Who's coming back is a weapon slinging, I'm going to slay my enemies. They're going to face God's judgment in Jesus. And they pull from the book of Revelation to justify that theology. So that's really important to realize because the Bible is not monolithic. It's not univocal in many different ways. But one thing I do want to add, and I think Monty will attest to this, when you're growing up in that movement, it is not positioned like this. And in your mind, you are worshiping the Jesus. You are following the Jesus. You are following Jesus. There's no separation between, the Gospels or not. There's books and theologies and preaching to kind of reconcile those two things. So when you grow up as a kid, you're introduced to Jesus. You don't know that this is a Jesus dipped in white supremacy. You're just taught this is who Jesus is. And if you don't follow him, you're going to burn in hell forever. That's why it's so compelling.
Yeah, it's called UFC Jesus, WWE Jesus.
I love it.
This rich is very white, even though he was born in Bethlehem, and of course watches American football and listens to country music because, of course, obviously, exactly how Jesus was back.
A lot of Kid Rock. It's on.
So much mid rock.
Yeah, so much Kid Rock with pickup trucks. But so much of this is culture and identity. So much is tied to identity, and so much now Donald Trump is tied to this type of white Christian identity. You know this, Monty, is that the base that just doesn't crack. Slowly it's leaking. But for the past 10 years, 75 to 80% of white Christians love their guy, Donald Trump. Rape, no problem. Violent insurrection, no problem. Failed Iran war, no problem. Mocking and ridicule the sick and the poor, no problem. And so many people who don't understand this movement, and I've had this conversation again and again, even in the comments right now. They're like, I don't get it. You've touched upon this before, but if you can dig a bit deeper, right? He's not like the prophet. He's like the Antichrist. He's not like Moses. He's like the Pharaoh. How can these Christians, with one part of their faith say, I believe in God and I read the Bible, but still suck at the rancid teeth of Trump, even after all this time? A lot of people do not understand, Monty. Can you break down the psychology?
Well, there is again some of that component of even if you disagree, you're afraid to advocate for it because you know you're going to be removed from your community. So there is kind of that threat of removal. At the bottom of this movement, as the same with everybody else, people want to be loved and they want to belong. And so there's a fear that they're going to be excluded. There's a fear. There's also this fear of I'm going to go to hell if I'm not in alignment with whoever I believe my teacher is. There's also a lot of, they have been taught for so long performative Christianity. So as long as someone says the right things, then, well, God forgave them, so it's okay. But this is really seen, especially in purity culture and especially within Christian marriage counseling. So Christian marriage counseling was founded by a man named Paul Popenoe, who was a eugenicist prior to World War II, and a white supremacist and an atheist. After that becomes unpopular, after World War II, he switches into marriage counseling to tell preachers, because preachers were really the only people that would grab onto his ideas, that white women should never get divorced, they should never marry outside their race, they shouldn't be on birth control, they should be encouraged to stay in their marriages no matter what happened, even in cases of infidelity and abuse. Wow. He founds Christian marriage counseling. He directly mentored James Dobson, which focused on the family and all of the family doctrines that would come from James Dobson. So we have this, what happens in the church especially is that if a man commits adultery or is abusive or something like that happens, he's strayed. He fell short. Well, he's sorry now. He's a new man. We see this with Russell Rebrand right now, going through carrying his Bible around because he's facing 6 counts of rape and sexual assault against 6 women starting on October 12th. So that language is already pre-programmed for them. And purity culture standard is different between men and women. It's not really like, actually with Tim's story, one of the things that was surprising to me was that he was taught to remain pure for marriage, because growing up for me, the men were never taught that, just the women. So a young girl will be dragged in front of the church and humiliated for a sexual encounter. But a pastor who grooms a teenager can just say, hey, I'm sorry, and the congregation will rally around him and pray for him. And Trump is capitalizing off of this pre-programmed belief. Well, if he says he's sorry, he's a new man now. Didn't you see? He's selling Bibles. He invoked the name of God. He knows that as long as he says the right things, it doesn't matter that he hasn't done the right things. This is also why, because of the hierarchy the church is built on, it's such a haven for abuse. Are you familiar with Bill Gothard?
No.
So
I'm
Bill-
stricken, Monty.
Bill Gothard was the Institute of Basic Life Principles, but he really helped establish true hierarchy more so in the modern era in the 80s and 90s. And he had this diagram called the umbrella of authority, and it was God's umbrella. It was designed by someone who doesn't know how umbrellas work, but it was God's umbrella, then the father, then the mother, then the children.
Mm.
And the idea behind it was that if any umbrella gets out of the protection of the umbrella above it, then Satan has access, then it's going to fall into disarray, then it's going to fall apart. So the whole rule was women and children have to submit to the man, whoever the man is, whether that's the father, whether that's your husband, whether that's your pastor. And if you don't submit to that man, then you're out of alignment of God.
Mm.
When you have a strict hierarchy like that, it's really hard to be held accountable. Bill Gothard was eventually removed from his own institute for harassing and sexually assaulting young girls and teens. But he was so powerful, this hierarchy was so firmly established, it took decades to get him out. So when you have that hierarchy where accountability is next to impossible, they're used to seeing it. They're used to men getting a pass, especially men in power. He was a man of God, and the 15-year-old tempted him.
Mm.
And you combine that with this idea that as long as you say you're sorry, and as long as you pretend to be a different person, oh, well, then we forgive you. It's why abusers run to the church before they face trial, or they run to the church when allegations start popping up. Because then what they think they can do is take the forgiveness of God to overwhelm and drown out the cries and the pain of their victims that they have no intention of making restitution to.
And also escape accountability. And that's
Escape accountability. So Trump has done on mass scale what has happened with the church hierarchy and with this language around purity and sexual sin that people have already grown up with. So for a lot of Christians, they don't see, they're so used to this kind of forgiveness rhetoric and this kind of, well, he's a new man. It's one of the reasons they love the story of King David from the Bible, who was a rapist and a murderer. Well, but look what he did with Bathsheba, and he killed her husband, and he was still a man after God's own heart. So for them, there's not a lot of hypocrisy because they've never been far enough out of the movement to see that dissonance. And what Trump and the Trump administration are doing is they're using rhetoric they're already used to hearing every day of their lives. And this has been going on since after World War II.
Tim, before I go to you for the
Right,
aspect of it all, I just want to ask Monty real quick. First of all, 10 out of 10 for Russell rebrand. I will use it. I will cite you.
That's a good
But before we get to the Pete Hegseth, because the Pete Hegseth of it all is exactly in line with what you said, explains Trumpism, MAGA, the white Christian nationalism that's in the Trump administration right now. I'm going to give that to you, Tim. But real quick, Monty, can you tell everyone, for those who don't know, what's happening with Russell Brand right now? Because another textbook example, like in real time.
So you guys are familiar. You've probably heard of Russell Brand, former comedian. Wasn't he married to Katy Perry? Is that right? Yeah, he was married to Katy Perry. So a couple years ago, allegations of assault started coming out about Russell. He's now facing sexual assault allegations, rape allegations, also strangulation of 6 different women. That trial starts in October. As soon as those allegations started to come forward, and as soon as they were extremely credible, he immediately ran to conservative Christianity. He announced that he had converted. He started bringing his Bible into court dates. He spoke at, it was either CPAC or Turning Point USA. I can't remember which one. It might have been both. But he speaks with them and he's like, I've repented, I'm reformed. And he was just recently on the Megyn Kelly show where he was like, yeah, I slept with a 16-year-old when I was 30, but I was an immature 30. And you know who doesn't get to be immature? 16-year-old girls, because they don't get off the hook. But he just admitted it on air. But Megyn Kelly has a vested interest in promoting that because she's the one who said, well, Epstein was interested in the barely legal 15-year-old types, which is illegal. It's not like he was interested in 8-year-olds. So it's kind of this mechanism that they're kind of feeding off of each other. But then later in the same interview, Russell says 15, 16-year-olds having sex isn't my business. It's like, so you do know they're kids. So you do know. But what he's doing is he is being such a performative representation of this version of Christianity. Because these are not real Christians. Like, let's be so for real. Real Christians are some of the most amazing people you'll ever meet. But this fake Christianity is totally different. And he's being such a good example of that. And then most recently, he was on Piers Morgan. And he was like, he was going to read him a verse that just helped him through the tough time of going to court. And Piers Morgan sits in dead silence for a minute just letting it
90 seconds, Monty.
90 seconds. It was so painful. My skin started to itch.
It was like a Michael Scott moment, like from The Office.
It was so awful. But
I didn't even watch it. I was cringing.
It was hurting. But, and I'm not a fan of Piers Morgan, but that use of silence was spectacular. But it was such a clear demonstration of you're just lying. You don't even know what this verse says that was so important to you. You can't find it in your Bible. And it's a very clear demonstration on kind of a larger celebrity scale, but a smaller scale than Trump's. It's the same thing, but he's trying to use this language of redemption to get out of accountability, because in this type of theology, an apology replaces accountability.
That was great. I really appreciate that breakdown. And I give it to you, Tim, to explain the Pete Hegseth of it all, because that's Russell Rebrand on steroids times 10.
Yeah, Russell Brand is a known grifter. He went left, then he went anti-vaccine. Now he's Christian, right? So there's like a real established pattern of him just changing his tune all the time wherever he gets the person used. I do think when it comes to Pete Hegseth, it could be a little more complicated than that, because people do convert and become all in. I mean, his pastor, Doug Wilson, that used so wonderfully dismantled, he's for real. He believes what he says. I mean, he's not cosplaying. He's been in this space for 50 years when it wasn't popular, saying this stuff, even when it wasn't popular in evangelical standards. Okay, so there definitely are.
Well, can you tell people what Doug Wilson has been preaching?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, where to even begin? But essentially, Doug, and I don't want to get too into weeds; it's complicated. But essentially, Doug Wilson is part of a non-charismatic version of evangelicalism. So what he preaches is a view of God that predestines some people for heaven, some people for hell. But he's steeped in white supremacy. So I clapped so hard, Waj, when you cited that Doug Wilson wrote a book with a known white supremacist, and he states that slavery was largely racially harmonious, and because of the gospel, slaves were treated well. And I'm like, oh my God, people don't know that. So Doug has been around in this world for a long time. He has always believed that women should have the right to vote. He has no credentials. He has no seminary degree. He is not licensed anywhere. He started his own denomination called the CREC, which, again, even by conservative evangelical standards back in the day, was seen as borderline heretical. Yeah. But the problem is that these people never kicked him out. They tolerated him like the uncle you see at Thanksgiving. So Doug Wilson has spent a lot of time embedding himself in this world. His publishing set called Canon Press published a book by Stephen Wolfe called The Case for Christian Nationalism. Stephen Wolfe has said on camera that under a Christian nationalist rule in America, women should not be able to lead, atheists should be thrown in prison, and he's all for blasphemy laws. I mean, this is what they actually want and what they believe. So that's who Doug Wilson is. This also matters too. Doug Wilson does not believe in the rapture. Doug Wilson is not a rapture guy. Doug Wilson believes that they have to essentially Christianize the entire world in order for Christ to come back. So his protege, Pete Hegseth, who has tattooed Crusader iconography on him, right? This Iran war is not just an American thing. In his mind, especially with Doug's teachings, they think that this is part of the greater mission to Christianize the world, right? Islam is evil, it's demonic in their mind. And so they have an obligation to be the hand and feet of God, not of Jesus, but of God, to bomb their neighbors into oblivion, which is why if you listen to any of Pete Hegseth's prayers or him quoting, Pulp Fiction instead of actual prayer, it's all war-based language, right? He really believes that he is being divinely used by the creator of all things to bomb school children in Iran. That's what they really believe. And for them, they're just getting started. I'll tell you two more things briefly. I've interviewed Doug Wilson before it was cool. Okay, I've talked to that man directly. He told us on the air before he dies, he wants Christ is Lord in the Constitution. That's what he wants written into the Constitution. One more thing that almost no one knows that will shock you. A week after 9/11, maybe even a few days after 9/11 happened, Doug Wilson preached a sermon, and he said the greatest tragedy of the past week was not the planes hitting the towers. It was the ecumenical worship service that happened in Congress, where there was a lady bishop, and there was an evangelical, there was a Hindu and a Muslim, and they all came together. That was the worst part of that week. That's how extreme Doug Wilson and his crew and Christian nationalism really is. So that's who we're dealing with. And that man has discipled Pete Hegseth, and I know, Waj, that you know this, and so do you, Monty. Not one congressperson asked Pete Hegseth about his ties to Doug Wilson during his confirmation hearing. Not even a Democrat. My jaw was dropping. Monty and I and many others have been screaming from the rooftop for years. This dude is such bad news, but
he's so bad. And also, I will say though, in it, like with his belief system, he has up until this point really kind of been on the fringe, and especially with social media and the manosphere and the red pillosphere is really exacerbating these type of beliefs. But he wasn't as fringe as people think he was. So I grew up in a very like far right environment, and but I will say to my family's credit, if they had ever seen someone wave a swastika, oh, that person would not have been on their feet for very long. Like my family would have taken that very personally. Like, absolutely not. If they had seen the Nazi regalia and the salutes that's going on now. But they were very like covert racist. They would say things like, well, and slavery really wasn't that bad. Most of the time they treated their slaves really nicely. But they would also say things like, well, in an ideal world, women wouldn't vote, their husbands would vote, but we understand that, the world's a little different now. So, but it was all coded language. They just weren't as upfront as Doug Wilson was. It's just now becoming mainstream. So then churches like what I grew up in that really did hold those beliefs at their core are now being much more vocal about it. But there is an absolute goal of this to repeal the 19th Amendment. They know that they're up ahead. They're up against a major battle in order to do that, and that's the purpose of the SAVE Act. If they can get something like the SAVE Act, they by default establish headship voting without ever having to change the Constitution.
Exactly.
And that's the big challenge.
And I don't think Donald Trump is leading legally or peacefully. For people who believe he will,
No.
I only say
No.
trust the evidence of your eyes and your ears, really. And furthermore, this Doug Wilson, folks, was invited to the Pentagon just last month by Pete Hegseth to give a prayer. And speaking about Doug Wilson, I don't know if, speaking about that clip that went viral, no, I appreciate all the kind words, folks. I think, like I said, sometimes history, fate, God chooses you to be at a specific moment. And in me trying my best to warn people about Hegseth and Wilson for the past year, I think all that training came to hand because Pete Hegseth, folks, wrote a book called American Crusade. 10 years ago, he drunkenly yelled, "Kill all Muslims." He has paid off a woman that he has sexually assaulted, and she wants to get out of the NDA to tell her story. He says no. His mother sent him an email that no son should ever get an email from a mom like that where the mom says you're an abuser of a woman. That's our Secretary of Defense right now with these cosplay crusader tattoos, who has redeemed himself for his lifetime of sins and now has the celestial stamp of approval to be God's soldier. And also, he's very fickle and weak. And then the Pentagon press apparently took a photo of him he didn't like of his butt. So he fired the press. Just goes to the weakness of these men, right? And I want to ask you, Monty, about the weakness of this man, because I'm, based on what you just said, Tim, about Doug Wilson's total lack of credentials. A lot of this makes sense to me now, because once we gave him that dressing down, I was waiting for him to retort. Pierce said, "All right, you can respond," and he had nothing. And then I'm like,
well, we know Jesus wasn't a socialist.
I watched that whole segment. Your whole segment. There was some even worse clips in there for Doug. It was horrific.
Problem. I'll pause and fix it. Come back. Nearly finished. Okay, I've got it set up. This is very important to people. They're getting into some conclusions that are revolutionary, very disturbing, but offering an incredible potential. Here we are. Okay.
Doug Wilson's total lack of credentials. A lot of this makes sense to me now because once we gave him that dressing down, I was waiting for him to retort. Pierce said, "All right, you can respond," and he had nothing. And then I'm like,
Well, we know Jesus wasn't a socialist.
I watched that whole segment, your whole segment. That wasn't even, there was some even worse clips in there for Doug. It was horrific. He had nothing at all. There was one moment, not one.
Nothing. And then 2 days later, he does like an 8-minute video. Someone sent it to me. I'm like, all right, maybe he'll be like, okay, let me get all my talking points. So I saw the 8-minute video, Monty and Tim. Nothing. And my mom was like, this guy, my mom said it to me. My mom was like, this guy has nothing. And my take on this was the following, based on what you all have said. I don't think he's ever been challenged. I think what he was most upset about, if you really go back at that clip, is how dare you? How dare you don't call me pastor?
That's right.
How do you not address me by my title?
That's right.
That's what actually incited everything. And then when I saw his video, he goes, they didn't even call me pastor. What more do I have to do? So much of it was like this, he just revealing his insecurity. But Monty, that was my take. Because he just couldn't get over it. He was shook.
Yeah.
The ego was punctured and he broke.
I'm going to say something that might be a little controversial, maybe not, but there's nobody more insecure and more submissive than a conservative man.
Ooh.
Nobody. They're the most submissive people you will ever meet. They make great drones. They make great soldiers. They want to be told what to do. But again, Doug is like, he's so used to being in a default position of authority where no one can challenge him, because if you challenge him within his church, you are challenging the mouthpiece of God. It's a very Pharaoh-esque kind of ideology of this is God's representation on earth. So of course he's never been challenged. Of course no one's ever called him out and said, you're a snake, you're like you're lying. No, I can imagine that his soul dropped into what is left of his soul, dropped into his feet when you said that, because he hasn't been challenged, because so much of this, and it's the reason that all the lies can take hold with these conservative men. So they're taught you're God's favorite, right? God gives you authority, no one else.
Yep.
Life guarantees you a personal servant that you get to sleep with. You know, you're going to have children for your bloodline, like you're fucking King Henry VIII passing on an empire. Nobody cares.
Yep.
But it's why so many of these ideologies like white replacement theory can take place, because they are so afraid. They are so afraid that they won't be significant. They are so afraid that they'll be replaced. They are so afraid that this imaginary authority is going to be taken away from them, that it's very easy to weaponize and mobilize them because of that fear. First of all, the entitlement that they believe that they have from God. And then second, this fear that they're going to be replaced. White replacement theory is just nonsense. It's nonsensical. And people's attachment to it shows their own insecurity in their place in the world. Because and two, like for men that grew up in the movement, I did, your definition of what a man is this big. And if you don't meet the credentials of what a man is, you failed.
You're a pussy.
You're a pussy. You're all these things. How dare you love your wife? What are you thinking, you simp? And so there's a lot of performance anxiety, the same way I would have performance anxiety growing up around like purity and my body and my sexuality and shoulder is the same thing that they do, that they have to meet these standards of masculinity, which always at the top end result in submitting the hardened for another man that tells you what to do.
I would be happy to see that as a man in this movement.
I was going to go to you because you got Patels and you got the Pete Hexeth and you got the Donald Trumps. You've got all these cosplay crusaders who seem to have the weakest chins, weakest knees, and weakest ankles.
Yeah, they never went to therapy, and so they started a podcast, which is a jab at me because I have a podcast, but I do go to therapy, you know. So, but I two things briefly. I mean, one, the thing about that video that made it so good for people who know Doug Wilson is because you expose that the emperor has no clothes or intelligence. Doug Wilson relies on little quick one-liners. He relies on being a king of the basement of fundamentalism, right? So that way all of this, oh, Doug, you're so smart, you're so brilliant. But once he got above ground and faced reality, Tim Miller is brilliant, just dismantled every single one of the Trump talking points. When you do that and you follow a liar, what can Doug go back on? Well, he tries to do these slick retorts that might have worked for evangelicalism about socialism. Everyone has an allergy to that word, but above ground, you guys are like, the hell? Like, is that all you got, right? So I think you did a good job of exposing what kind of a fraud Doug actually is. Being a man in this space is kind of wide, but I mean, look, there was a famous book called Wild at Heart that I read, and the general thesis is,
What was the name of the book
it's
again?
called Wild at Heart by John Eldridge, and the thesis is that every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. That's like the general thesis of the book. And here I am, 18 years old, like, yeah, I gotta fight a battle, I gotta wage war, and I gotta find a beauty to rescue. My friends and I did a Braveheart sword ceremony together. I used to have a replica Braveheart sword hanging over my bed. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, because you're just taught that, like, as a man, you're called to lead and you're called to be courageous. But like Monty said, they're actually just training your mind to follow the man above you. Right?
Yeah.
I had to submit to my pastor at all costs. I couldn't tell people that, hey, you're voting for a guy who brags about assaulting women. All of a sudden now I'm the heretic, even though I'm standing on principle, right? So it's a really weird world where you think you're so bold and so courageous, and you're going to like these men's retreats where you're doing push-ups and you're pretending that you're like army rangers. Like, these are real things that happen in this church world. Like, they call them, boot camp and stuff like that. And you get home and you're just a simp. You're just a simp for the MAGA regime, but you don't see it that way. And I think, just to extend a piece of empathy, I think that obviously patriarchy affects women the worst. It also affects men. When you have the weight of the entire world on your shoulders, you have to be this person that is bold and this and that and this and that, is the provider and is a good dad and is this all on your shoulders. That absolutely weighs on men as well. So it even harms them. The standard that is totally unrealistic. And I think that's important to recognize as well.
No,
Well, and I think for men, for men, what I see most is the long-term mental health implications of movements like this,
yes.
because it is constantly telling men you are never enough. You're
Wow.
never quite reaching it. The Overton windows continues to move. So those men start to submit and serve harder and harder and harder because they think, if I just do this right, if I just get this accomplished, then I've made it. But you never make it. You never make it. And that's the point of the whole movement. And it's the same thing with women. Well, if you didn't wait till you get married, well, then that's a problem. But if you also don't want to have sex every second of the day with your husband, well, then you're a problem there. You had too many kids. You didn't have enough kids. You didn't have your kid naturally. You had a C-section. There's never a point where you're enough, because if you're enough in the movement, they lose you. It is a movement in trained obedience, not moral integrity. They teach you what to think, not how to think.
That's right.
And that's why you tripped up Doug Wilson so much, is they have these clobber verses and they've got their talking points. You see it with every social media influencer, the really conservative pastors. They have all these clobber verses. And this is why I teach a deconstruction Bible study for this reason. And I tell people, this is not to convert you to anything.
Right.
We're going to go through the history. We're going to talk about the language. We're going to talk about who wrote it. We're going to dig through these. And my goal of it is that when you can have those conversations, because you know anything about that passage, they fall flat on their face because they haven't actually read it. They haven't actually studied it. They've memorized a list of Christian apologetics. And once you pull that rug out, which is what you did, you saw what he did. He went back to Christian apologetics, socialism. And actually, as a matter of fact, in Acts, the early church was socialist.
Yeah.
They sold everything they owned and distributed it equally.
Yeah.
And they were a pacifist movement until they joined the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries under Constantine. So it's a totally different thing. But when you know that, it completely pulls the rug out. But for so many people, they're high control environments. And it ranges. Like for me, I couldn't listen to secular music. The movies I could watch were highly policed. I couldn't read secular books. And so they control what information you access. And so for a lot of people, this is the only world that exists for them.
Well, I appreciate that. I hope you guys can stay only for 10 more minutes. I'm mindful of your time. I have time, but I don't want to be greedy, even though people are loving this and I could speak to you all about this forever. There is something.
A series.
You should. I'm going to bring you all back if you all can. But this.
I'd love to.
I really appreciate you talking about what this impact this has on men, and the way you've described that, both Tim and Monty. If you think about it, folks, this is exactly how MAGA behaves. This is exactly how Donald Trump behaves, right? They have no substance. They get on social media. They're all on signals like, we'll have this clip. We have this clobber verse. And then as soon as you challenge it, they crumble, right? And they never leave their safe spaces. And then they usually belittle you with names, and that's exactly.
She's got a nose ring.
Right.
Yeah. I know you're upset because I had to be 18 to get it. It's okay.
It's the last 3 days. Look at Donald Trump. You're so mean. The left. Jimmy Kimmel. Man, it's all skewed. It's all rigged. It's all safe spaces for me. No space. Safe space for you. Civility for me, cruelty for thee. And then, I want to ask you all about this, just digging a bit deeper, because, and this is not in any way, shape, or mocking them, although sometimes I think it's good to mock them. But this unattainable perfection and how the Overton window keeps shifting to the right. Because now in order to be a man, you have to be a UFC fighter. Now you have to like literally get in the ring and clobber another human being. You have to have supplements. You have to have abs. By the way, folks, a little detail that people might know, I've always kept this in my back pocket. People who type in and Google for supplements for penile erection or like all those supplements, guess where they are? MAGA places. People that vote for MAGA, right? There's someone heat mapped that one time. Speaking about heat maps, wherever Grinder goes, Monty and Tim, oh my gosh, with MAGA, like Grinder.
Every RNC.
Tim, talk to us about this. Talk to us about like the people who are just trapped and closeted in the sense that not even closeted when it comes to their sexuality, but like you kiss your wife, gay. You like show warmth to your son, gay. You are nice to like a black person, gay. You open the door for a woman, gay. Talk to us about how much this homophobia and this misogyny destroys the men and also further suppresses the closeted men.
No, I mean 100%. Oh, sorry. I thought
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
You go ahead. You go first, and then you, Monty.
All right. Just briefly, I will say I'm not sure about Monty's experience, but this seems like a more public phenomenon. Like even growing up in this world, it wasn't this bad for me as a man. Like I was taught that it's good to love your wife and to give her a kiss and stuff, But I do think we have to acknowledge the rise of like the Groyper movement and like just the internet and the gamification of things, especially for young men who fall into these internet just worlds that are just so not tied to reality. But these people like your Nick Fuenteses and your Andrew Tates and all, Myron Gaines, they get into the ears of these men. There's very little community in society right now. Right? All that's being broken down. And they end up in this world where like, it's just, when you really think about it, it's such a twisted view of what it means to be a man, right? Like, I mean, again, I can't imagine like not hugging my kids. Like, why would that be gay? And by the way, what's wrong with being gay? Like, you tell me what is wrong with this, right? So I think that it's been really...
Well, even having sex with women is now gay. I'm not making this up, folks. They say having sex with women is gay. Some of them avoid masturbating because that's gay. Some of them avoid cleaning their genitals because that's gay.
Well, I definitely avoided masturbation, but that was because I was going to go to hell and God would judge me, not because I was gay. The problem was I was too straight in that case, So, yeah, that's just for me in my world, being a little bit older, not so much online when I was younger, to be more coming from like the Groyper alt-right meme movement that seeps into some of the evangelical world as opposed to the opposite, but maybe Monty has other data on that. That's my best guess of where that's coming from.
Yeah, and also, real quick before I give it to you, Monty, those names that you mentioned, the Andrew Tates, the Myron Gaines, the Nick Fuentes, I pay attention to these people. I've been trying to warn people to take them seriously.
Yes.
They all get into the religion grift. Andrew Tate becomes Muslim. Myron Gaines is Muslim. They're like, word? Really? And then all these Muslim men are like, brother, give him another chance.
Yeah.
Exactly what you said, Monty, but from the Muslim angle. Give him a chance, forgive him. I'm like, I don't think he's changed in any way, shape, or form. Nick Fuentes, white Christianity, right? They use the celestial stamp of approval to continue their misogyny and their homophobia. But you, Tamanti.
So the homophobia is the result of the desire for hierarchy, and that's why it marries so well to misogyny, even if the misogyny online is not rooted religiously, like at least in an outspoken way. Because the homophobia comes from the church requires this very strict hierarchy. It's the type of hierarchy they're trying to legally implement in the country where women are always subservient. But also the church, just like the home, the country, cannot thrive without the unpaid labor of women, and they have to maintain that hierarchy. The LGBTQ community disrupts that hierarchy because they disrupt gender roles. So in an effort to maintain that hierarchy, they have to demonize whatever disrupts them, because the LGBTQ community gives us expression, freedom, authenticity, choosing yourself, and it disrupts this idea that as humans, we have to show up in the world in a specific way versus being unique to ourselves. But the second part of it is that the homophobia is rooted in the control of the men they want to weaponize, because they're not teaching these young men how to be men. They're teaching them how not to be women.
Exactly.
That's what's happening. So the demonizing of anything that's feminine gets used in this kind of volatile language to continue to weaponize these men. Because when you hear like Myron and all these people talk about, all these women want, 6 foot, 6 figure, six pack.
Yeah.
Those are male gaze things.
Totally.
That's the male gaze is what they're describing. They're describing what would attract them to another man and then stamping that on women. But the goal of it is in order to make men angry and isolated, don't tell them how to be a good man. Tell them how not to be feminine. And you can weaponize them against the thing that you have told them will make them worthless.
And to your point, Monty, notice all these men who coach and train young men on what women desire. They never talk to women. Isn't it interesting?
Fascinating.
Ever.
Or if they do, they talk to like a teenage girl who like clearly has nerves around public speaking. They never speak to someone who's like an equal advocate, but they're also typically single. So
and when they did what was the documentary Into the Manosphere when Myron Gaines and his then girlfriend's being interviewed, and she says the truth, and all of a sudden she has to go clean a different room. So it's like it's you're exactly right. They don't talk to women, or when they do, they're like that. Or when they speak up, they're then well, go back into the closet and do your thing.
Yeah, it's what attracts them to other men. Power, a cosplay crusader, this image,
wealth, image.
Tell me I did a good job, Dad.
Yeah, and then women are like, can you just like be normal and like ask me out for like coffee?
Like just don't be a creep.
Just don't take photos of my feet, please.
Listen,
empathy, the same talk to be empathetic,
The same guys that are in my comments telling me, like slut shaming me, calling me names, misgendering me, saying I'm a man. I'm like, it's not my fault. I'm taller than you. Are the same men that are in my DMs asking if they can pay me to dom them.
Yeah.
So.
And can I just say real quick before I want to ask two more questions? All this, I remember. Okay, folks. I'm for those who don't know, Monty and Tim were talking for the first time. Even though my politics is progressive, the irony of it all is I'm like a very straight-laced, middle-aged Muslim dad. Like I don't drink. I've been a teetotaler my whole life. I eat only halal. That doesn't make me a better person, but it's just very funny because Muslims are like, he's so progressive. I'm like, dude, I guarantee you I'm more traditional than many of them. I know what you're doing in the deal. It's very similar. Christianity, Judaism, Muslims, a lot of people are like, I'm the alpha man. But then I'm going to go take shots of alcohol on Friday night and have sex with women. And then the next day I'm going to go and cry in the mosque. And then I'm going to like call women whores, right? Does it sound familiar, Tim and Monty? You're right. So I remember in UC Berkeley, just a real quick point, I have to mention this. I'm at UC Berkeley, it's English major. One of the partners in our breakout group was this really sweet, very smart woman. If you look at her, it looks a little bit mousy, unassuming, pretty but unassuming. You'll never assume that she's a dominatrix. And I find out, like one day we're just talking, I'm like, she's like, where do you work? And she goes, the House of Dominatrix. And my Muslim brain rewired it to House of Dogs and Pets because my brain was unable to. So I said, did you see the House of Dogs and Pets? She goes,
what's that?
House of Dominatrix. And the reason I mention all this is even though I'm like a PG dude, my curiosity. So for the next, I'm like, a dominatrix. I have so many questions. I must ask her everything. That's all I remember for that entire semester. And what she told me, Mom, and I've always told people this, I said, who is your client? Who is your number one client? My number one client, she says, are successful, professional, upper class white men. I'm like, what do they ask of you? Do you have to do things for them? Oh, no. They ask me to do things to them. 90% of them come and I humiliate them, mock them, and dominate them. I just wanted to say that. I just wanted to share that little story.
The data is in, folks.
The data is in. That's the Wachatelli story, which seems to be consistent. I want to ask you this, Tim, real quick, then I want to ask you a question, Monty. Is the hesitation of our society and our institutions and our corporate media to call this threat for what it is, white Christian nationalism. You know this, I know this. They always say we have to call it religious nationalism. We can't call it white Christian nationalism. How important is it to name a threat for what it is, specifically this threat?
Oh, it is of the utmost. How can you combat something that you can't name?
Yeah.
We have to. Also, let's tell the truth. We live in an age of propaganda at rates I think humanity has never seen before between technology, algorithms, the administration, etc. Right? And if we can't tell the truth about this, we're in real deep shit. Frankly, we have to be truth tellers. And Monty and I'm still very much a Christian, very much. In fact, I'm more of a radical than ever, I would argue. And similar to you, Watch, I've never been drunk, I've never smoked. I'm pretty PG in a lot of ways, right? but really, there are Christians out there who are like, we have to call this out because we know what is coming. It's a shame that the media is either A, too scared because they don't want to lose their audience, or because they think that right-wing media will then weaponize it, or B, because the billionaires have control so many more media outlets and want to keep their power in check, right? But that's why independent media like yourself, like Monty, like Under the Desk News, I mean, all the creators, Aaron Parnas, that's why that work that we're all doing is so important, because people don't understand, especially folks who did not grow up in this basement of fundamentalism. I know it's impossible to fathom what it's like being taught at age 9 that if you don't pray a prayer, you're going to burn in hell forever, and that you're in the Lord's army, and that this is just how the world works. I know it's hard to fathom, but it's real, and millions of us were indoctrinated to believe that, and many of us stayed to continue on that legacy. The last thing I'll say is that we also have to be aware this is not new. I think people think, well, where did this come from? This is not a new phenomenon at all. You can trace it back, I mean, really early. I would start with the name R.J. Rushdoony in the 50s and 60s. There has been people for decades planting these seeds, these little bricks, piece by piece by piece, to get us where we are. Trump is a fruit of this movement. He's not a bug. He's not a mistake. He is where this is all leading. So the more people do the work now to understand how deep these systems go, how well funded they are, the better off we're going to be. Because once people realize that they want women not to have the right to vote, that's incredibly unpopular. I'm like, watch, I'm with you. Expose them and disrespect them on the air. The leaders of Christian nationalism deserve to be exposed for the charlatan frauds that they are. I have no respect for Doug Wilson. He's not a pastor. He's a charlatan who preaches hate and should be exposed as such. So we have a lot of work to do, but we absolutely must name it and call it what it is.
It's a Christian dominionism project. They want domination, not just of America, but globally, folks.
Yeah, and R.J. Rushdoony that Tim mentioned is kind of the founder of what's called dominion theology,
Yep.
which then gave birth to the Seven Mountains Mandate and this idea that Jesus needs your help to come back, so Christians have to take over the world to do it. And I think that one of the reasons that people are so afraid of calling it Christian nationalism is because of the Christian persecution narrative that the conservative movement has built so well over decades, right? They've considered taking, 10 commandments get taken out of school. They're attacking our Christian faith. No, they're just not showing favoritism to a religion in a public space. But they have been able to fuel this idea that Christians are constantly being persecuted in the US. Christians have never been persecuted in the United States. And so what they have done is they have repeatedly fed this lie. So now I think that a lot of people are afraid that if I say Christian nationalism, they're going to claim that I'm persecuting them. And the thing is let them claim whatever they want.
Yep.
We have to start naming it and saying, you're not being persecuted. You are, in fact, the bully. You're the person that wants to take rights away from other people. And you're over here jabbering about small government while you're totally okay with the government telling someone how they can express their gender, how they can walk around, what clothes they can wear. That should be something that's a personal decision, that if you actually believe in religious freedom and you actually believe in small government, are no-brainers. But they have built and instilled this Christian persecution rhetoric so well that it's made a lot of people afraid to face them and call them out.
You all will really enjoy coming back here because we've talked about Christian dominionism, we've talked about the Seven Mountains Mandate, and a lot of people, once people find out about Seven Mountains Mandate, they're like, no,
The hell?
And then they're like, what?
And then the Ellison chat ends up being a lot different.
Yep. And they're like, oh, they want to control, Seven Mountains, seven pillars of society, art, media, school, church, business. Oh, they want to control all the pillars to implement Christian dominionism. Oh, look, they're literally openly admitting it. Oh, they're in the White House. Oh, look, Paula White. Paula White, Russell Hawes, Hegseth, and Mike Huckabee, who's more of a Christian Zionist, but still, dominionism. Yes. They want control. Final question for you all, and I hope you all can come back. This was a fantastic conversation, and to have 2,100 people at a 2 p.m. on a Tuesday talking about white Christian nationalism, hey, it's the testament to the strength of our guests today. You're about deconstructionism, right? You want to deconstruct this ideology and this theology and this white supremacist movement. Final question to you for today, both Monty and Tim, is how can we reconstruct something better? And I'll go to you first, Monty.
I think the way that we reconstruct something better, and this is what I teach my followers, this is what I teach in the studies and classes that I give, is that curiosity is the king. Like, we have to be willing. The way that we construct something better is by being willing to ask the questions and following the truth no matter where it goes. The truth is never afraid of scrutiny. And in order to build a world we actually want to live in, we have to be honest about the world that's already been built. One of the things about American exceptionalism is I had this grief about it of realizing I wasn't in the country I thought I was, but that doesn't mean that I can't build it. We lost him.
No, I'm here.
There you are.
I thought you got
But that doesn't mean that we can't build it. So I think that the way that we build something forward is yes, radically loving our neighbors and building the communities we want to be in. But that comes with enough curiosity and honesty to ask questions, find the truth, and then decide, okay, what do I want to make moving forward? And whatever the truth is, it's worth it. Ultimately.
Great. That's great. How about you, Tim? Because I know you're like, I want to. You're still a believer. You take it very seriously. You want to take back your faith when these people have hijacked it. How can we reconstruct something better, especially in America, because so much of American Christianity, as has been mentioned, has been tainted by just racism, capitalism, greed, and misogyny.
Yeah, so two quick points. Number one, we have to, for Christians out there, we have to find a better path forward in our faith. It's just that simple. The organization that I founded, it's a nonprofit called the New Evangelicals. It's a great place for people to start. Everything is free. There's no cost to anything. We have our private community. We interview top-tier scholars, all kinds of resources for getting your faith involved and really getting above ground, away from that fundamentalism and learning, shocker alert, that maybe we don't have to choose between God and loving our neighbor, but maybe how we show our love for God is by how we love our neighbor, right? So I think that's really important. You know, Jim Wallace says that the answer to bad religion is not no religion, it's better religion. And I don't mean that in like this in the political sense of we need a new, better Christian theocracy. No, secularism I think is the way there. But we need to give people a better path, right? Most people are still spiritual. Most of us have still been shaped by Christianity in some way, shape, or form. I don't think the answer is nothing. You know, I think the answer is actually, what if you lived out the teachings of Jesus and actually believed what he taught? What would the world look like if we decided to participate in forces that bring heaven to earth instead of hell on earth? I think that's important. The second thing I'll say is we have to build a society and a coalition that has shared values instead of shared beliefs. Me and my friend Andrew Seidel, who Monty and I just saw a couple of days ago.
Andrew. Yeah.
I love Andrew.
Great. Yeah, I love Andrew. He's an atheist. I'm a Christian, and we share the same values despite getting there differently. My friend Qasim Rashid, a Muslim. We talk all the time, right? We have different beliefs. We arrive at the same shared values. That is the path forward. And one good piece of news for the audience. I know we're talking about a lot of bad stuff. Christian nationalists are a fringe minority in America. About 30% at the most are going to hold some view of Christian nationalist views, and the really hardliners are even more rare, about 15%. Obviously, they have a lot of power right now, but their views are wildly unpopular. So I do think if we work together, build broad coalitions, Christians find a better path forward in their faith, and we actually vote, all of us, we can absolutely get this stuff out of our country before it's too late.
No, that was wonderful. And Monty, I didn't ask you this, and if this is too personal, let me know. But are you still in some way, shape, or form a believer? Do you identify, or have you left entirely?
So a couple things on that. So I don't talk about my faith a lot online because for me, I never want to be a religious leader. I don't want to be a Joel Osteen. I don't want to be someone who dictates faith to people. My mission is that people discover faith on their own and stop outsourcing it to other people. But I will say that following the teachings of Christ is the core tenet of my life. And I think that a lot of times when people get wrapped up in doctrine and divinity, it's not the point. Jesus said, honor the divine, love God, love people, full stop, end of sentence. I will always live my life by that. And my purpose is to help people come out of these dark, high control spaces, give them a safe place to try out their bandy legs, to ask questions, and then come to whatever faith is really resonant for them. But for me, the teachings of Christ are always going to be the core tenet of how am I living in the world? Am I making the world better because I'm here, or am I making it worse?
That's right. No, that's beautiful, and I appreciate you resisting the temptation to become the spiritual guru of so many people.
The grift, listen, that grift is extremely financially lucrative.
It is,
and I resent it so deeply. Because when my platform first took off, I had some people be like, "Start a church," and I do want to start a community center in Nashville that gives people resources and education and like child services and a mutual aid like food pantry. But I don't want to get into that space because I am so sick of these people making so much money off grifting and off of really true, like people that are true believers that are trying to find the way, that are getting caught up with these leaders. I am a teacher.
Yes, exactly. Same. No, and that's, because folks, I'm telling you, I know people who've gone down that pathway, the adulation, the fame, the women, the clicks, the likes, the money. you turn Gollum real quick, even with the best of intentions.
Yes.
And I'll end with this before I shamelessly promote both of you. And thank you so much for your time. And I hope you both can come back. The audience loves it. We have.
Oh, we have to do it now.
Yeah,
I'd be honored.
It's look, as people know, spoiler alert, I am a practicing Muslim, and believe it or not, I went to an all-boys Jesuit Catholic high school, and I'm just built this way, folks. Some people are just built like, believe in God. If I could leave, I would. My life would be so much easier. I need Satan. Bacon looks amazing. All right, I get it. I drink, I take shots. I don't know, but some people are like this. And what I've always said is, you might be done with religion. And I know why you'll be done with religion, especially organized religion. But religion isn't done with America yet. That's where we are. And many people who are looking, they're still looking, even if they might be nuns, N-O-N-E-S, even if they've left, the church or the synagogue or the mosque, they're still looking. They're still looking for meaning. They're looking for purpose. They're looking for community, and they're looking for value and a meaningful life. And when people who have a faith-based tradition, when they rely upon our prophets and our shared history and our religious values, you can actually move towards social justice. That's how you get an MLK. That's how you get a Malcolm X. That's how you get Romero. That's how you get liberation theology. That's how you get Gandhi, right? They're all rooted, if you really think about it, in a type of spiritual training and spiritual values. So that doesn't mean you believe in God. That doesn't mean you join a church or a synagogue, but it can be and has been used as a force for power and good. And if you seed the ground, these frauds come and take it over. That's all I'm saying. Don't seed the ground to these fraudsters, to these misogynists, and these hate mongers. That's Waj's sermon of the day. Monty, can you shamelessly please promote yourself?
Yes, you can find me at Monty Mader everywhere. That's Monte, like Monte Carlo, and Mader, MontyMader.com, Instagram, Substack, YouTube, and next year I have an upcoming book.
Did I make this up? Are you like a singer also?
Yes, I'm also a metal vocalist, and I have an album coming out this year as well.
Metal?
All in the same place.
All right, this is might be my most controversial question. Top 3 metal bands.
At the end of the stream, Jesus.
Like today?
No. Okay, I'll give you an error. 70 to 95.
70 to 95. And again, this is for me. This is not objective. This is my opinion. Black Sabbath, huge integral piece for me. I have to put Metallica in there. I know it's like cliche with the resurgence of Stranger Things, but I have to put it in there.
So you can't, especially the early albums, can't go.
Yeah, especially the early albums. I'm trying to think, like late 80s. I don't know who I'd put at number 3. The only thing that keeps coming to mind, I have fixations, and I'll like go revisit an album and I'll get hooked. And all I've been listening to for 3 weeks is Lateralis by Tool, and so that's like the only thing that's showing up in my head.
Right. We're in sync. I was waiting. I'm like, she's got to put Tool in there.
Yes, Lateralis I think is one of the best albums front to back that's ever been made.
Respect. I might have to agree with that. I grew up with those. That's Tool is the underrated one that people don't put in there. Tim, I have to ask you the same question.
Well, I'm a former professional drummer, so I'm also in the music world. I mean, what's up? What'd you say?
Dream Theater.
Yeah, Dream Theater, of course, right? Live at Budokan, great album. I mean, I'm more of a hardcore, like more underground metal and like heavy stuff. So my top 3 bands are like Under Oath is a big one for me. I love the band Protest the Hero. They're unbelievable. And then I'm gonna throw this is not metal, but Dirty Loops is one of the best trios out there.
They're so good live.
They are. I agree. I saw them in Philly. They are
Dirty Loops.
Dirty Loops. They are insane. Funk trio out of Sweden. You would never know unless you saw them. But I'm a huge fan of those 3 bands. So
who would have thought that we would be talking about these people? Are like, wait a second, what? Human beings are complex, folks. Please, if I may, real quick, folks, this is the Left Hook. Everything is free. There's no paywalls. I'm a terrible capitalist. You pay, if you can, the $5. If you can't pay the $5, I have a permanent 25% off special. The lefthook.substack.com/special. It's $3.75 a month forever. For those people, because I know times are tough right now, and with Iran, the gas prices are going to go up, especially as we just found out that UAE is leaving OPEC. What could go wrong? Everything. But if you can't pay anything, it's free. So just subscribe. And if I may, Monty and Tim, Ground News is a partner that's come on to support the Left Hook, and it started by a woman who was a NASA scientist. And the reason why I decided to join up with them is because they support my friends, Qasim Rashid, Mehdi Hassan, Jen Welsh, and Ground News is an auditor and aggregator of world news. So all the news in the world, it's a one-place shop for aggregation. But why I teamed up with them is they audit the news. So you find out who owns each news site, you find out their bias, if they're trustworthy, and you find out if they go left or right. And furthermore, they do a spotlight where you can literally see how the right wing and MAGA is looking at an issue and how the rest of the world is looking at an issue. So I thought it was very useful. And for everyone who's watching, Monty's viewers, also Tim's viewers, they have a 40% off special. So it's called thegroundnews.com/hook. I don't get any money from it. Give it a shot. Groundnews.com/hooks, 40% off. If you like it, let me know. If you don't like it, let me know. So that's for everyone who's watching right now. Thank you all for watching.
And we do need Tim's plugs so that everybody can.
Oh yeah, Tim. Sorry.
No, it's really good. It's at Tim Whitaker Speaks. Thanks, Monty. On YouTube, on Instagram, Substack. I also use Ground News, so I co-sign. Go sign up with that link. It's a great platform. So I'm a huge fan.
Thank you all for watching. For those who are tuning in late, I'm with Monty Mader and I'm with Tim Whitaker. We're going to have this up on our Substack later today. And I hope you all can come back because I try to talk about this as often as I can because I think it is one of the major enduring threats to not just America now, but as we see with the Iran war, to the world. And people aren't talking about it, which infuriates me.
I'll yap anytime. Give me a call.
Anytime.
Thank you, Monty. Thank you, Tim. Thank you all for watching. I'll be back in 12 minutes with the great treat of Parsi to talk to us about what's happening in Iran. Everyone take care, be kind, and please, oh please, don't be a fascist or a white Christian nationalist.
Amen. Co-sign.
See ya. Thank you both.
Right on, huh? Okay. That's more confirmation than I expected at any time. To conclude that what we're facing is white supremacy. Zionism, okay, they want to collaborate with the white supremacists. So they think that's going to get them somewhere. What's the difference between being second on the firing line or first on the firing line? Palestinians are first on the firing line from this crusade. And guess who's next? Okay. The United States is not going to allow the United States to be an independent country. That was demonstrated, when they got the order to stop bombing Beirut. Complied, even without a vote of the Security Cabinet, rather, of the Israeli government. So that's proof in and of itself. Happen again. And when they do violate ceasefire, it's with the agreement of the United States. Do not fret about that. Okay, there's lots more to say. Until next week, then. This is Dr. Abraheim. And see you again in Here and Now at a later time with more news and developments as well. Developments.